The shuttle ramp had not finished lowering when Gunnery Sergeant de SciFi heard the sound of a body hitting composite decking, and she was moving before the ramp locked. Across the receiving yard of MilitarySciFi Academy, in the long blue morning light off the station's outer ring, a Dren cadet twice, the height of a grown man, had a human boy pinned against a support strut by the throat. 3 more Dren stood in a loose crescent behind him, watching with the flat patience of an audience that had seen this show before. An instructor in Academy Gray stood 10 meters off with his arms folded, doing nothing. Desad did not run. Running told a room you were afraid of what was happening. She walked, unhurried, duffel still on her shoulder, and by the time anyone thought to notice her, she was already close enough to matter. "Let go of him," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The Dren cadet's throat sac flexed once, a dry, rank click of irritation, and he did not let go. That was the day everyone at MilitarySciFi learned her name, though it would take 3 more months, a burned campaign, and one very still morning in the training yard before they understood what it meant. The boy against the strut was maybe 19, sandy-haired, one eye already swelling shut, and he was not crying. Desad noted that first, filed it, kept walking. The Dren holding him, young, big through the shoulders in the way of a cadet who had not yet earned the right to be that confident, turned his head at her voice with the slow, contemptuous economy of something that did not consider her a threat worth full attention. "Instructor business," he said in accented Concord trade tongue. His words came out with the faint percussive click that marked Dren's speech, hard consonants riding a subvocal hum in his chest. "Proving, not yours." "I'm not asking twice." The instructor in gray finally moved, but only to step between her and the cadet, palm out, the universal gesture for stand down dressed up in different bones. "You are new," he said. It was not a question. His 4-jointed hand indicated the duffel, the fresh Terran compact patch on her shoulder, the way she had not yet been issued Academy Gray. "You do not interrupt the proving of another species cadets. This is regulated tradition, Sergeant, older than your treaty." "Then it can survive him letting go of my cadet's throat for 10 seconds while we talk about it." Something in the way she said "my cadet" made the instructor go still, not the boy's kind of still, not fear, but recalculation. He was easily 60 years by human reckoning, hide gone the color of weathered slate, 3 parallel scars along one jaw ridge that had the deliberate symmetry of a mark earned rather than an accident survived. He looked at her for a long moment with black, vertical-pupiled eyes, and something crossed behind them that she filed away too, because she had seen that look before, on humans who recognized a rifle before they recognized the person carrying it. "Korvath," the instructor said without looking away from her, "release the whelp." The big cadet Korvath, she'd remember that, opened his hand. The boy dropped, caught himself against the strut, and did not immediately run to her, which she also noted with something that was not quite approval yet, because approval came later, after she understood what it had cost him to hold still, and not give the others the satisfaction of watching a human flee. "Drill Marshal Austin Vray," the instructor said. "Head of cadet discipline for the joint program, and you are the one fleet sent. Gunnery Sergeant de SciFi, Terran Compact Liaison, effective this morning." She did not offer a hand. Dren did not shake hands. She'd read the brief on the transport, one of 40 pages she'd absorbed in 6 hours because command had given her exactly 6 hours notice, and a 1-line mission brief that told her everything and nothing at once. 5 human cadets at MilitarySciFi. Something is being permitted to happen to them. Fix it without giving anyone a reason to say humanity can't be trusted with a seat at the table. Vray's throat sac pulsed, slow, unreadable to her yet. "We were told a training officer was coming, not—" He stopped himself. "Not a woman," she finished for him, mild as weather. "I get that a lot. It stopped mattering to me around the Third War." Something flickered again behind those black eyes. Recalculation, a second time faster now. He did not answer that. Instead he gestured at the boy who had straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of one hand, doing his best not to look at either adult like he needed rescuing. "Cadet Ford will explain the proving to you," Vray said. "It is customary. It is regulated. It ends the moment the junior signals yield. No academy instructor may intervene before that signal by treaty of interspecies custom unless there is mortal risk. There was none here. His face says otherwise. His face will heal. That is the point of the proving, to discover what does not break." Vray inclined his long skull, a gesture she would later learn was the Dren approximation of a shrug, weight and consequence folded into 6 inches of movement. "I did not make this rule, Sergeant. I enforce it. As will you, if you wish your cadets to remain enrolled." He left after that, unhurried, the 3 other Dren cadets peeling off behind him like a wake behind a slow ship, Corveth last. And Corveth was the only one who looked back at her before he went, a long look, head slightly canted, throat sack giving one dry click that she did not yet have the vocabulary to translate, though she would learn soon enough that it meant something close to interesting, the same word a wolf might use for a shape it had not decided yet was prey or rival. Dessat turned to the boy. Up close he was taller than she'd first thought, raw-boned, the kind of build that would fill out in another 2 years if the academy did not break him first. His name tape read Ford. "Cadet Elias Ford," he said, because she hadn't asked yet and he clearly wanted to get ahead of the question before his voice could betray him. It nearly did anyway. "Sorry you had to see that, Sergeant." "Don't apologize for someone else's hands." She looked at the eye, already going the deep plum color of a bruise that would be spectacular by nightfall. "Sick bay first. Then you're going to tell me everything Drill Marshal Vray didn't." He didn't argue. That told her something too. Meridian Spire turned out to be a wheel 11 kilometers across, spun for a full gravity along its outer ring, home to just under 9,000 cadets drawn from every species that had signed the Concord Compact in the last 40 years. Hulking amphibious Threndi from the Tide Worlds, small quick-eyed Olin scholars with iridescent down instead of hair, a scattering of species she had no names for yet. And at the very bottom of a very long hierarchy of seniority, 5 humans. Earth's Provisional Compact membership was 6 years old, dated from the ceasefire that had ended the Threshold War, and it came up for full ratification in 11 weeks, when a Concord assembly would vote on whether humanity graduated from provisional asterisk to asterisk permanent, whether the 5 cadets standing somewhere on this ring right now were the leading edge of a real seat at the table, or an experiment the Concord could still, politely, let lapse. Command had not needed to spell out for her what would happen to that vote if human cadets got photographed being carried out of Meridian Spire on stretchers, nor what would happen to it if a human instructor was photographed putting a Dren cadet in the infirmary for touching one. Either photograph killed the same vote. That was, she understood within the first 10 minutes of her first day, the entire design of what she just watched happen in the yard, and it was not clumsy. It was surgical. Sick bay was run by a Threndi medic with skin like wet slate and hands that moved with unsettling gentleness for something that size. Elias sat on the edge of a cot, while the medic ran a scanner over his throat and made a low rolling sound that might have been sympathy. "Bruised trachea, not torn," the medic said, mostly to Dessat. "Third time this rotation for this one." "Third," Dessat repeated. "Fourth if you count the wrist in autumn cycle," Elias said, quiet, staring at the far wall. "It's fine. It's regulated." "Stop saying regulated like it's a synonym for fine." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a second she saw exactly how tired 19 could get. "What do you want me to call it, Sergeant? It's in the treaty annex. Species get to keep their internal customs as long as nobody dies. Proving's a custom. We knew that going in." "Did you know they'd pick a custom you're built wrong to survive?" That landed somewhere he hadn't expected, because his jaw worked once before he answered. Sir. The proving ends on a yield signal. What is it? He hesitated a half-second too long. A click, subvocal. Comes off a throat sac. Which humans don't have. No, Sergeant. So when Corvath had you against that strut, there was no sound you could have made that would have made him stop. Elias didn't answer that at all, which was its own answer, and Dessau understood then, with the particular cold clarity she'd once reserved for reading terrain before a jump, that this was not hazing that had drifted out of hand. This was a rule built with a hole in it exactly the width of a human throat, and somebody at Meridian Spire, maybe Vray, maybe someone above Vray, maybe someone who had never once set foot on this station, had known precisely how that hole would be used, months before her orders were cut. She met the other four that evening. In the cramped common room the Academy had allotted the human cohort, a space built for 8 and stretched to hold 5 bunks, 5 lockers, and a single window that looked out on the slow wheel of stars as the ring turned. Priya Anand was there first, a compact, dark-eyed engineering cadet who did not stand up when Dessau entered, but did stop what she was doing, which in the first 10 seconds told Dessau more about the room's internal politics than a week of briefings would have. Naomi Cross came in behind her, quiet, moving like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in hallways where that mattered. Devon Marsh, the youngest at 17, sat on his bunk with a data slate he wasn't really reading. Ito Sakamoto came last, favoring his left leg in a way he clearly hoped nobody would clock. "You're the one from the yard," Priya said, "not hostile testing." "I am." "You didn't hit him." "Wasn't the day for it." Priya's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Vray's already telling everyone you're going to get all of us thrown out for interfering with tradition. Vray can tell everyone whatever helps him sleep." Dessau set her duffel down, took the one empty chair, and did not sit like she was in charge of the room because she wasn't yet, not with these 5, and pretending otherwise would have cost her more than it bought. "I read your files on the transport. I know your marks. I know Cadet Sakamoto's knee has been flagged twice by sick bay and cleared for training both times in under 6 hours, which is faster than any human joint should heal and faster than any human doctor should sign off on. I know 4 of you have filed at least 1 report against a senior cadet this rotation, and I know none of those reports went anywhere. I'm not here to tell you it's fine. I'm here because it isn't, and somebody finally admitted that loud enough for Fleet to hear it." Devon looked up from the slate he hadn't been reading. "Why now?" "We've been asking for a liaison since last cycle. Because in 11 weeks the Concord votes on whether Earth gets a real seat instead of a provisional one, and somebody with a very long memory decided that was exactly the moment a handful of cadets nobodies watching might quietly stop showing up to class. She let that sit. I don't think that's an accident. I think somebody is running an experiment on you 5 to see what conclusion the Concord reaches about the whole species, and I think Drill Marshal Vray is either running it or covering for whoever is." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Ito said low, "So what do we do?" "You keep showing up to class." She looked at each of them in turn, unhurried, the way she'd once looked at green recruits the night before their first real patrol, back when her job had been to make sure as many of them as possible came home boring rather than heroic. "You keep your marks up. You don't give them a photograph of a human losing control, and you don't give them a photograph of a human breaking down, because either one ends this the same way, and you let me handle the rest." "The rest being Corvath," Priya said. "The rest being whatever comes." It was Naomi, who had said nothing until now, who asked the question that told Dessau she'd chosen well when she pushed for this posting instead of a comfortable training command back on Terra. "Are you actually going to be able to stop it, Sergeant? Or are you going to be one more adult who tells us to hold on?" Dessau considered the girl for a long moment. 19, medical track, hands that had learned to be very steady very young for reasons that weren't in the file, but were written all over the careful way she watched the door. I've held a position for 6 days on 11 hours of sleep, and nobody behind me flinched, because I told them what I was going to do, and then I did exactly that. No more, no less, every time, Dessa said. I'm not going to promise you this stops tomorrow. It won't. I am going to promise you I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't mean to lose. It wasn't comfort, not the kind Naomi had probably wanted. But something in the girl's shoulders came down half an inch, and Dessa understood that was the only currency that would ever work in this room, and filed that away too, alongside Elia's silence and Priya's testing, and the wet slate patience of a medic who signed off on a boy's knee twice in one rotation, because the alternative was admitting how it kept getting hurt. Commandant Aldous Reyes received her the next morning in an office that looked out over the academy's central atrium, 3 tiers of glass and pale stone rising toward a domed sky window that showed the turning stars. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, Terra's senior diplomatic officer aboard Meridian Spire, and on paper, the man to whom every human complaint on this station was supposed to flow. He offered her coffee, real coffee, a small luxury that told her he'd been aboard long enough to have earned trade favors from someone. She declined it and stood instead of sitting, because sitting would have taken longer to leave from, and she did not intend to be here long. I read the incident report from the yard, Reyes said, before she could open with anything of her own. You handled it correctly. Firm, no physical contact, no escalation. That's exactly the posture Fleet needs from you here, Sergeant, and I want you to understand how much is riding on you maintaining it. I understand what's riding on it, sir. What I want to understand is why nobody above me stopped it before I had to walk into it my first hour on station. Reyes's jaw tightened just slightly, the specific tightness of a man who had been asking himself the same question for longer than he wanted to admit. Because the treaty annex on cadet custom is real, Sergeant, not an excuse Vray invented. Every species aboard this academy keeps internal disciplinary traditions. If I intervene in Dren custom as the human administrator, I hand every hardliner on the Concord Council exactly the argument they've wanted for 6 years. That humanity doesn't respect other species' sovereignty, that will use force to override tradition the moment it's inconvenient to us. That argument alone could sink ratification faster than 5 bruised cadets ever will. So the plan is to let them keep getting hurt until the vote's over. The plan, Reyes said, and for a moment the diplomat's polish cracked enough that she saw the tired old man underneath it, is to survive 11 weeks without a single incident either side can point to as proof we don't belong here. I know how that sounds from where you're standing. I've sat in this office for 4 years watching good cadets absorb things I couldn't stop without losing the entire reason they're allowed to be here at all. That's not a plan, sir. That's a hope with paperwork. He didn't argue the point. That more than anything he'd said told her exactly how much room she had to work with, and exactly how alone she was going to be doing it. I'm not asking your permission to protect my cadets, she said. I'm telling you what I'm going to do so it doesn't surprise you later. I'm going to train them. Hard and correctly and within every regulation on this station, so that by the time the Concord Assembly walks through that atrium in 11 weeks, there is nothing about 5 human cadets left to exploit. And if anyone puts hands on one of them again in a way that isn't survivable by their own species' rules, I will end it, in front of as many witnesses as I can arrange, in a way that makes the exploitation the story instead of the humans. Reyes studied her for a long moment. You make that sound like a certainty. It is one, sir. I've just been in this job longer than you have. She left him there in his glass office over the turning stars, and did not look back to see whether he believed her, because it did not matter yet whether he did. It would matter in 11 weeks. Everything else was just the work of getting there. The training yard at 0500 belonged to nobody, which was exactly why Dessac claimed it first. 5 human cadets, still blinking sleep out of their eyes, formed up on the cold decking under a sky dome still showing the deep blue of station night cycle. And she walked the line the way she'd walked lines of recruits half a galaxy and one war ago. Academy PT starts at 0700, she said. We're not doing Academy PT. Academy PT is built around Dren joint tolerances and Threndi buoyancy, and about 9 other things that aren't you. From now on, the first 2 hours of your day are mine, and they are built around what you actually are, which is the one thing nobody on this station has bothered to train for. Which is what? Ito asked, wary. Endurance nobody expects, and control nobody can provoke. She nodded at the practice mats someone had hauled out before dawn on her order. Corvath and his crew are testing for a breaking point. Every session, every shove, every so-called proving they're gathering data on how much it takes to make a human either quit or swing first. I intend for the answer they get to be more than you have, on both counts. That starts with your bodies being able to absorb what theirs can, which means today we find out exactly how far off you are, and it will not be a comfortable number. It wasn't. By the half-hour mark Devon was on his knees dry heaving. Naomi had gone the color of old paper, and even Ito, who'd played 2 seasons of provincial rugby back on Terra, was moving like a man twice his age. Desad did not slow the pace. She also did not stand at the edge shouting the way the Academy's own instructors did during joint sessions, needling for the satisfaction of watching cadets fold. She ran every set alongside them, matched their pace exactly, and when Devon finally straightened up, wiping his mouth, ready for the humiliation he was clearly braced for, she only said, "Again," and started moving, and he followed her because there was nothing in her voice that gave him permission to feel small about it. 3 weeks into that routine, on a morning cold enough that breath fogged even inside the ring's climate control, Corvath found them. He came alone, which she noted immediately, because alone meant curiosity rather than theater. He stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed over a chest plate of natural chitin the color of wet slate, and watched Priya work through a grappling sequence with Desa that ended, 4 times running, with Priya's forearm locked against Desa's throat in a hold that would have ended a fight against anything with a windpipe in the expected place. "You are teaching them to choke," Corvath said finally, in the clipped trade tongue he used for humans, each consonant riding that low subvocal hum. "I'm teaching her to end a fight in 4 seconds instead of 40, Desa said, not looking up from resetting Priya's grip. "Different lesson than the ones I've seen you teaching. The proving is not about winning. No, it's about who gives up first. I know, I read the annex." She straightened, finally turning to face him fully, and did not step back despite the 2.5 meters of him looming over her. "Here's what I don't think you've thought through, Corvath. You keep proving something on cadets who can't give the signal that would make you stop. That's not tradition. That's a rigged game, and you know it's rigged, or you wouldn't keep picking humans instead of picking Threndi, who'd break your jaw for trying." His throat sac pulsed, a long, low clickum she still couldn't fully parse, but his eyes, 4-lobed black things with a faint inner shine in the low light, did not leave hers. "You speak as if I chose the rule." "I don't think you did. I think somebody older than you handed you a rule with a hole in it and told you it was tradition, and you were young enough and hungry enough for rank to not ask who benefited from the hole." She let that land, watched something shift behind his eyes that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame. "I'm not your enemy yet, Corvath. I'm just the first person who's told you the truth about the game you're playing, instead of cheering you on for winning it." He didn't answer. He turned and left, unhurried, and Priya watched him go with an expression Desa recognized, because she'd worn it herself once, a lifetime ago, the first time an enemy had looked less like a monster and more like a young man who'd been handed a bad set of orders and had not yet earned the judgment to refuse them. "You think that did anything?" Priya asked. "I think it planted something. Whether it grows before or after somebody gets hurt again, I can't promise you." Desa reset her stance. Again. The escalation, when it came, did not come from Corvath. It came 3 days later in the cafeteria on the second tier, where Devon Marsh made the mistake, a small one, an honest one, the kind any 17-year-old exhausted from 6 weeks of 0500 conditioning might make, of taking the last tray of the human-safe protein blend that Ussan Marr, one of Corvath's crew, had also been reaching for. Ussan was younger than Corvath, hungrier for status, and had none of the older cadets' new hesitation. He did not wait for approving. He simply drove his shoulder into Devon hard enough to put the boy through a stack of collapsible tables, and when Devon came up swinging, human, 17, humiliated in front of 200 cadets from 9 species, Ussan caught his wrist and bent it backward with the flat, unhurried cruelty of someone who had learned that cruelty performed slowly played better to an audience than cruelty performed fast. Dessa was 2 tiers away when Naomi calmed her, voice tight and level, in a way that told Dessa the girl was holding herself together through sheer will. By the time Dessa reached the cafeteria, the instructor on duty, not Vray, a younger Dren proctor named Kell, was already standing over the scene with his arms folded, and Devon was on the floor, wrist bent at an angle that made 2 Alan cadets at a nearby table look away, and he still had not made a sound. Wrist fracture, the Threndy medic said 40 minutes later, scanner humming over Devon's arm in sick bay. Clean, sets in 9 days with the brace. Dessa said nothing while the medic worked. She had learned, across a career of watching young people get hurt for other people's reasons, that the moment right after the injury was never the moment to speak, because whatever she said then would be heard as anger, and anger was the one photograph she could not afford to give anyone. It was Devon who broke the silence, staring at the ceiling, jaw tight against the pain block taking hold. "I didn't even want the tray, Sergeant. I could have had literally anything else on the line." "I know." He didn't even look like he needed a reason. "He didn't," Dessa agreed. "That's the part I want you to understand because it matters more than the wrist. He didn't need the provings rules to justify this one. This wasn't tradition. This was a 17-year-old alien deciding a human was small enough to hit because nobody with authority in that room had ever once made him believe there'd be a cost." She looked at the boy until he met her eyes. "That's the thing I came here to change, not the tradition. The belief that there's no cost." She reported the incident to Vray within the hour, in writing, with the medical scan attached, and requested formal disciplinary action against Cadet Ussan Marr under station-wide assault codes that applied regardless of species custom, since a blindside shoulder check over a food tray fell under no interpretation of a regulated proving. Vray's response came back within the day, and it was, in its way, the most educational document she'd read since arriving at Meridian Spire. Cadet Marr had been issued a formal caution. No suspension. No transcript notation. The drill marshal's note, appended in the clipped, correct trade tongue of a man who knew exactly how thin the ice under him had gotten, read, "Isolated incident between junior cadets, unrelated to proving custom, resolved at instructor discretion per Academy Code 14.3. Cadet Marsh is advised to exercise greater caution in shared dining spaces going forward." Dessa read it twice, standing alone in the human cohort's cramped common room after lights out, the others asleep or pretending to be. Then she folded the data slate closed, set it on the small table by the window, and looked out at the slow turn of stars for a long moment, the way she used to look at a horizon the night before she knew, with total certainty, that the next day was going to require something of her that couldn't be trained in a classroom. Advised to exercise greater caution, as if it were Devon's wrist that had made an error in judgment. She did not raise her voice. She did not put her fist through anything. She sat with the anger the way she'd once sat with incoming fire, letting it pass through her without asking her body to answer it yet, because the day she answered it was going to matter more than any day that had come before, and she intended to choose that day herself. Word of the cafeteria incident moved through the academy, The wayward always moved through a station full of bored, hierarchy-obsessed adolescents from 9 species, fast and wrong in most of the details, and settling finally into a version where a human had been disciplined for provoking a senior cadet. Dessa let that version stand. She had learned a long time ago that correcting a rumor cost more than it returned, and that the only correction that mattered was the one written in results. She changed the morning training instead. "We're done training like victims," she told the 5 of them, a week after Devon's wrist went into its brace, the boy sitting out the physical work but present anyway, because she'd told him presence mattered more than participation right now. "Every drill from here counts double. You're not just building endurance. You're building something they can watch because they are watching every morning whether we see them or not." She was right. By the 4th week, a small cluster of off-duty cadets from 3 or 4 species had taken to loitering at the yard's edge during the 0500 sessions, drawn first by curiosity and then by something closer to fascination, because what Dessa was building in 5 exhausted, aching young humans was not spectacle. It was precision. She drilled them on falls until falling stopped costing them anything. She drilled Priya on leverage until the engineering cadet, barely 160 centimeters, could put a training dummy twice her mass on the ground in under 2 seconds using nothing but the dummy's own momentum. She drilled Naomi on stillness, actual stillness, breath control, the discipline of holding a position for 20 full minutes without a single visible tremor, because Naomi's steadiness under pressure was the one gift the girl had walked in with, and Dessa intended to sharpen it into something the girl could use rather than just survive with. It was during one of those stillness drills that the Alan scholar first spoke to her. The Alan cadet, small, downy, quick black eyes set in a face built more for reading than for confrontation, had been part of the loitering audience for 2 weeks before she introduced herself as Nell Afrenia, 3rd cycle history track, and asked, with the particular bluntness of someone who had spent her whole life being underestimated by larger species and had made peace with using it, whether Dessa understood why the Dren cadets had started watching the drills instead of mocking them. "Enlighten me," Dessa said, toweling sweat from her neck while the cadets cooled down behind her. "You are teaching them the Kelvash walk," Nell said, and when Dessa's expression didn't change, the Alan tilted her head, feathers along her crest lifting slightly in what Dessa had learned was surprise. "You do not know the word." "I don't." The Kelvash is the apex predator of the Dren homeworld. Every Dren cadet grows up on stories of it. It does not chase. It does not posture. It becomes still and it waits, sometimes for days until the prey forgets it is there, and then it moves once and it is already over. Nell's crest settled. Dren instinct reads absolute stillness as the most dangerous thing a body can do. It is bred into them the way your species is bred to flinch from a sound like a large predator's roar. You have been teaching your cadet, the quiet one, the medical one, to hold a Kelvash's stillness for 20 minutes at a time. I do not think you meant to, but every Dren who has watched her do it has felt something they do not have language for outside old stories. Dessa looked back at Naomi, sitting cross-legged on the mat, spine straight, breath slow and even, sweat cooling on her skin, utterly unaware that she'd just been described to her sergeant as something out of alien folklore. "That's useful to know," Dessa said, carefully, filing it away in the same place she'd filed Vray's recalculating look on the first morning, and Korvath's unreadable click, and the particular way Vray's throat sac had gone silent, not agitated, silent. The one time she'd walked past him without moving at anything close to a hurried pace. "May I ask you something, Sergeant?" Nell said, "off the historical record." "Go ahead." Drill Marshal Vray fought in the Threshold War, ground campaign, the Calder Ridge Theater on the Dren side of the ceasefire line. I know this because I wrote his citation file for the Academy archive 3 cycles ago. The Alan's black eyes were very steady. There is a unit designation in that file I have never been able to fully translate from the old campaign reports. The nearest rendering in trade tongue is something like the still ones. Human reconnaissance elements who did not move, sometimes for days, and were, according to the survivors Vray commanded, functionally undetectable until it no longer mattered that they had been found. Vray lost 11 cadets under his direct command to a single element of 4 in the space of one night at Calder Ridge 6 years ago. Nell paused. I do not think it is coincidence that the human officer who arrived at this station 11 weeks before the ratification vote moves the way she does, Sergeant. I simply think you should know that Drill Marshal Vray likely already knows exactly who you are, and has known since the manifest cleared. Dessas said nothing for a long moment, standing in the cooling morning air with the towel still in her hand, watching Naomi rise slowly from the mat and help Devon stretch his good arm. Calder Ridge, she said finally quiet. You were there. I was the 4. Nell did not flinch, did not step back, only inclined her downy head in something that was not quite a bow and not quite simple acknowledgement. Then I think Drill Marshal Vray's silence on the matter of your cadets is not indifference, Sergeant. I think it is the silence of a man who has spent 6 years hoping he would never again be in a room with you, and has just discovered he is going to spend 11 weeks in exactly that room. That changed the shape of things, though it took Dessat 2 full days of turning it over before she understood how. Vray was not a simple bureaucrat protecting a convenient tradition. He was a man who had buried 11 cadets because of what people like her could do without ever raising their voice, and he had spent 6 years since the ceasefire building a career on the belief that the war was over and the ledger was closed. Her posting to Meridian Spire had reopened it, whether she'd meant to or not, and every choice he'd made since. The yard, the cafeteria letter, the careful non-intervention looked, from this new angle, less like malice and more like a frightened man trying to prove, to himself as much as to anyone, that the old fear no longer applied. That he could stand in a room with a still one and not be the one who broke first. It didn't excuse the risk. It didn't excuse 11 weeks, so far, of a rule with a hole cut exactly the width of a human throat. But it told her something about how the ending would need to be built, when it came, not just a lesson delivered to Corvath and his crew, but a reckoning aimed at a much older wound, one that would need Vray to be a witness rather than a casualty if the ending was going to hold. She began, after that, showing up early to the yard on the mornings Vray ran his own perimeter check, and she did not speak to him, and she did not walk fast, and she let him watch her not hurry past him 3 mornings running, close enough that he could not pretend not to notice, far enough that nothing about it could be called a threat by any regulation on the station. By the 4th morning, he stopped completing his perimeter check on that side of the yard at all. She counted that as the first real ground gained in 11 weeks, and did not tell the cadets why, because some things a sergeant carried alone, and this, the slow reopening of an old soldier's private ledger, was hers to carry until it was time to close it. The joint field exercise fell in the 9th week, a mandatory 3-day survival evaluation run in the academy's enclosed wilderness bay, 6 square kilometers of engineered terrain under a false sky, cycling weather, real cold, real hunger if a cadet's rationing failed, real consequences if a cadet's equipment failed at the wrong moment on the wrong slope. Cadets were assigned into mixed-species fire teams for the exercise, a policy the Academy held up as proof of its integration credentials whenever a Concord delegation toured the facility, and Dessat had known, the moment she read the team assignments, exactly what was coming, because Elias Ford had been placed on a 6-cadet team with Corvath, Usson, and 2 of their crew, and the team leader listed for the exercise was Cadet Yulth Karn, the quietest of Corvath's circle, and Dessat had learned from 3 weeks of careful watching, the one most eager to prove himself worth the other's attention. She could not refuse the assignment. Refusing it would have been exactly the kind of interference Reyes had begged her to avoid, the kind that handed hardliners their photograph. So she did the only thing available to her. She spent 2 nights before the exercise drilling Elias alone, past midnight, on cold weather survival skills. The academy curriculum did not formally require of first years, because the curriculum assumed a fire team would share equipment and warmth in good faith. And she had stopped assuming good faith from that particular fire team the moment she'd seen the roster. Cache everything you can spare somewhere they won't think to look before the first night, she told him, walking him through packed contents by the yard's low security lighting, breath fogging between them. Thermal liner goes against your skin, not your pack, because a pack can be dumped down a ravine and made to look like an accident. You carry striking flint in your boot heel as well as your kit, because kits go missing. And if your rebreather cartridge comes up faulty at altitude, you do not wait for anyone on that team to notice. You come off that mountain the moment your readout amber flags. No exceptions. No waiting to see if it's a sensor glitch, because I am not training you to survive their tests. I am training you to survive them wanting you not to. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold, in the dark. You think they'll actually try something, not just leave me out of the fire circle. Actually try something. I think a boy who's been quietly proving himself to Corvath for 3 months just got handed 6 square kilometers of unsupervised terrain, and a human he's allowed, by the rules, to make suffer without a single instructor watching. I think that's not a coincidence any more than the cafeteria was. She checked the seal on his boot heel herself twice. I hope I'm wrong. Train like I'm not. She was not wrong. On the second night of the exercise, at an altitude the false skies weather cycle had dropped to a brutal simulated -30, Elias Ford's rebreather cartridge failed at 1,100 meters, on a ridge 2 kilometers from the nearest monitored checkpoint, in conditions that would put a human unconscious from oxygen starvation in under 6 minutes if he did not act immediately. And it failed exactly 40 minutes after Yulth Karn had redistributed the fire team's spare cartridges among the other 5 members for what he'd logged, cheerfully, as efficient load management. Elias came off that mountain alone, on a cracked ankle he did not report until he was inside the checkpoint's heated perimeter, because he had learned from a woman 3 months prior that a boy who waited to see if a sensor was glitching sometimes did not get a second chance to be wrong about it. He triggered his beacon at the checkpoint threshold and collapsed the moment the door sealed behind him, and the medic who reached him inside 4 minutes told Dessa afterward, flatly, that 4 more minutes on that ridge would have made the difference between a bad night and a body bag. Dessa did not sleep that night. She sat beside his cot in sick bay until dawn, watching the boy breathe, oxygen mask fogging with each exhale, and she thought, with the particular cold clarity that had once kept a 4-person element alive for 11 days behind a line that should have killed them in 11 hours, about exactly how close this game had come to producing the outcome its rules were built to allow. She filed the incident report at 0600. It was, by any honest reading, unambiguous, a documented equipment failure, a documented redistribution order from Cadet Karn that left 1 team member's spare cartridge unaccounted for, a documented near-fatal outcome. She requested a formal academy inquiry, not disciplinary action under Dren custom this time, but a station-wide safety review, the kind that could not be waved off with a note about exercising greater caution, because equipment tampering during a survival evaluation fell under Concord-wide cadet safety statute, above any species' internal tradition. The inquiry opened. It also, within 4 days, quietly stalled, evidence log incomplete, Cadet Karn's account differing from the equipment telemetry in ways the review board characterized as requiring further data, a promise of resolution that kept sliding, week over week, toward a date conveniently close to the ratification assembly, after which everyone in that cramped common room understood without saying it aloud. The entire matter would simply cease to be politically relevant to anyone but the 5 people who'd lived it. "They're going to let it disappear," Priya said flat, the night the review's 3rd delay notice came through. "Aren't they?" "Probably." Desai did not soften it. She had promised them the truth on day 1, and she was not going to start managing their expectations now, 3/4 of the way to whatever came next. That's how this kind of thing survives. Not through one big cruelty anybody has to answer for. Through 100 small delays nobody has to answer for either. So what's the point of any of it? The training, the reports, all of it. Elias from his cot, voice still a little rough from the oxygen mask, but steady. If they can just keep sliding the paperwork until the vote's over and none of it matters. Desai was quiet a moment, choosing the words the way she'd once chosen a route across open ground, not the fastest path, the one that left the fewest places for something to go wrong later. "The paperwork was never going to be what stops this," she said. "I filed it because a record matters, because someday someone honest is going to want to know exactly how this was allowed to happen, and I intend for that someone to have everything they need. But I never told any of you the review board was going to be the ending. I told you I'd end it myself, in front of witnesses, at a moment they couldn't slide off a calendar." She looked around the small room, at 5 tired faces that had absorbed more in 11 weeks than most cadets absorbed in a full training cycle, and did not see anger in any of them, because she had spent 11 weeks teaching them not to spend their strength on the wrong target. "That moment's coming. I need you to trust it's coming even when the paperwork tells you it isn't. Can you do that?" It was Naomi who answered first, quiet, steady, the girl who could hold a Kelvash's stillness for 20 minutes without a tremor. "We've been doing it for 11 weeks, Sergeant. What's a few more?" She found the thread that led to Ito's knee 2 days later, and it was Naomi, again, who handed it to her, because a girl on the medical track noticed things about sick bay's paperwork that a combat officer would never have thought to look for. 2 clearances in 1 rotation, both under 6 hours, both signed by the same senior medic, Naomi said, laying it out on the common room's small table with the flat clinical precision Desai had come to recognize as the girl's own version of stillness under pressure. "I pulled the general clearance time averages from the Academy's open training archive. 6 hours is fast for a joint sprain. It's essentially impossible for what Ito's scan notes actually describe: partial ligament separation, moderate swelling, a healing timeline that should have kept him off the mat for at least 4 days both times." Desai took the slate, read the notes twice, and felt the same cold clarity settle over her that she'd felt reading Elia's file her first night on station. "You're telling me sick bay's been clearing him early on purpose?" "I'm telling you somebody's been telling sick bay to clear him early. There's a difference, and I think it matters which one it is." It mattered, and it took her 4 days of careful, unhurried pressure to find it, because the Threndy medic who'd signed both clearances did not break the way a cadet broke. He was 50 years into a career built on the quiet, competent species across the Concord trusted with their bodies, and when Desai finally sat across from him in his own office, off-duty, no rank between them but the plain fact of 2 adults who had both spent decades cleaning up after other people's decisions, he told her the truth without much resistance at all, because he had clearly been waiting a long while for someone to ask him properly. "Cadet Sakamoto's training slot is contested every rotation by 2 other candidates for the same specialization track," the medic said, hands folded, voice heavy with something that was not quite guilt and not quite resignation. "I was informed, both times, by a senior administrator outside my own department, that an extended medical hold on a first-year human cadet during a competitive placement cycle would be interpreted by the ratification observers as evidence the joint program's physical standards were too demanding for the species to sustain. I was asked to certify him fit slightly ahead of full recovery, so that his placement would not appear to have been affected by injury at all. Asked by whom? He gave her the name without hesitation, and it was not a name from Ganeth's faction at all, which surprised her more than she expected. A mid-level human administrator in Ray's own diplomatic office, 3 tiers down from the commandant, who had apparently decided, entirely on his own initiative and with what he no doubt believed was the program's best interests at heart, that the safest way to protect humanity's image ahead of the vote was to quietly manufacture the appearance that human cadets never got hurt badly enough to need real recovery time at all. He was trying to help, the medic said, reading something in her face. I want to be honest about that, Sergeant. I do not believe there was any malice in it. I believe there was cowardice, the ordinary kind, the kind that convinces a frightened man that a small dishonesty now prevents a larger catastrophe later. I signed both clearances because I told myself the same thing. I am telling you the truth now because I have watched what you built at that yard for 2 months, and I no longer believe protecting your species from the truth about itself was ever actually protecting anyone. She took the finding to Ray's directly rather than routing it through any formal channel, because she had learned, across 11 weeks, exactly which fights needed a witness, and which needed only a door closed and a hard conversation behind it. Ray's face, when she laid out what the medic had told her, went the particular gray of a man realizing the danger he'd spent 4 years watching for had been standing 3 doors down from his own office the entire time. I'll have him reassigned within the day, Ray said. And I want the medic protected. Whatever consequence there is for signing those clearances, it belongs mostly to the man who pressured him into it, and I intend the record to say so plainly. I'd also like Cadet Sakamoto examined properly, not cleared, examined by whoever your best specialist is, with instructions to fix what's actually wrong instead of managing how it looks. Done, today, if the specialist's schedule allows it. Ray's rubbed a hand across his face, and for a moment looked every one of his 60-some years. How many more of these are there, Sergeant? How many more small, well-intentioned dishonesties am I going to find out I've been standing next to without noticing? I don't know, sir. I know the only way to find out is to keep asking the question instead of hoping the answer stays buried until the vote's over. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, the fact that you asked that question at all and meant it is further than most administrators I've served under would have gotten in 4 years. You're not the villain of this rotation, sir. You're just the man who finally got tired of hoping caution was the same thing as safety. Ito's knee was corrected properly within the week, not the 2-day procedure that would eventually give him his full stride back for good. That would come later, closer to the rotation's end. But enough of an honest diagnosis and a proper brace to let him train without quietly re-injuring himself every time Dissat pushed the mornings harder. He did not learn the full story of why his clearances had come so fast for months, until long after the arena, until a rotation's worth of trust had made it safe for Dissat to tell him plainly rather than let him keep wondering why his knee had never quite believed the paperwork that cleared it. I kept thinking I was just weak, he told her, the day she finally explained it, quiet, working through the last of the anger a slower revelation might have cost him weeks earlier. That everyone else was handling the mornings and I just wasn't built for it the same way. You were handling it on a joint that was never properly allowed to heal twice, because a frightened man 3 tiers up decided your pain was inconvenient to a photograph nobody had even taken yet. Dissat watched him process that, watched the old doubt finally leave his shoulders for good. That was never weakness, Ito. That was you finishing full training sessions on an injury that should have kept you in a brace for a week each time. I don't know many cadets, human or otherwise, who'd have called that anything but exactly the kind of durability this whole academy claims to be testing for. Word of the failed cartridge did what the review board's paperwork would not. It moved through the academy's cadet population in the way real fear moves, quietly, cadet to cadet, past every proctor's notice. Desai watched the shift in small things. A friendly cadet holding a door for Naomi that would not previously have registered a human's existence. Two Alan scholars asking Devon, with genuine scholarly curiosity rather than mockery, how a species without echolocation or heat sensing managed to navigate a whiteout at all. A first-year Vashti diplomatic cadet quietly relocating her study group's usual table, so it no longer sat directly beside Corvath's circle in the dining hall. The academy was not a monolith. It never had been. It had simply been a room where the loudest cruelty went unanswered long enough that everyone else had learned to look away, and now, slowly, people were starting to look instead. Corvath found her alone at the yard's edge 2 mornings after the review board's 3rd delay, and this time he did not stand at a distance. "Karn will not be disciplined," he said without preamble, the trade tongue clipped and for the first time she'd heard from him, uncertain at the edges. "The board will find the telemetry inconclusive. I have seen this pattern before. It is how the academy protects a cadet whose family sits on the home delegation." "I know." "You know and you are not," he stopped, throat sac pulsing in a pattern she still couldn't fully read, though she was beginning to recognize its rhythm as something close to agitation aimed inward. "I did not order the cartridge redistribution. I want you to understand this. I have done many things to your cadets I am no longer certain I can defend, Sergeant, but I did not order that, and Karn did not tell me until after, and when I asked him if he understood what he had done, he told me he was merely testing whether the human was as durable as you claimed." "And what did you tell him?" Corvath's 4-lobed eyes held hers, and for the first time since the receiving yard, she saw something in them that was not contempt and was not curiosity, but was closer to something she recognized from 30 years of commanding young people who'd been handed bad orders by people who should have known better. "I told him a Kelvash does not need to test whether the ground beneath it will hold," he said. "It already knows. It is the ground that should be asking whether it can hold the Kelvash." He held her gaze a beat longer and then, unhurried, inclined his skull, not the shrug gesture she'd learned meant dismissal, but something with more weight in it, closer to the ritual courtesy afforded to a superior. "I do not know yet what I believe about your species, Sergeant Akafer. I know I no longer believe what I was taught to believe about the shape of approving. I thought you should hear that from me before whatever comes next comes." He left before she could answer, and she let him go, filing the exchange alongside everything else, because a story like this one was not one in a single conversation with a boy who was still, whatever else he was, only 19 years old and only beginning to understand how badly he'd been used. The Concord ratification delegation's advance notice arrived 6 days later, and it changed the shape of the remaining time more than anything Corvath had said. Reyes summoned her to the glass office again, and this time he did not offer coffee. "The full assembly delegation toured the academy in 9 days, he said, sliding a data slate across the desk toward her. "Formal review of the joint cadet program, ahead of the ratification vote. Every species training track will be observed, including a live demonstration of disciplinary custom. Proving included, Sergeant, because the delegation specifically requested to see it, and refusing would itself be read as evidence we have something to hide. They're going to watch it happen. They're going to watch a sanctioned, supervised demonstration, with senior instructors present at every stage, expressly designed to show the Concord that interspecies discipline functions safely within the treaty framework." Reyes's mouth was a thin line. "I have fought for 6 years to keep this academy's reputation clean enough to survive scrutiny like this, Sergeant, and I am telling you plainly that if anything happens during that demonstration that looks like either a human cadet breaking or a human officer losing control, it will be the single image every hardliner on the Concord Council uses for the next generation to argue humanity was never ready for a seat among equals. And if I let 5 more weeks of this become 9 more days of exactly the same thing, staged for an audience instead of hidden from one. What does that make me? Reyes did not have an answer for that. She had not expected him to. I need to know who they've slated for the demonstration proving, she said instead. He checked the slate. Cadet assignment falls to Drill Marshal Vray's discretion, per program design. He has not submitted names yet. He will submit Elias Ford, Dessau said, with a certainty that came from 11 weeks of watching a pattern complete itself. And Korvath will not be the senior paired against him. How could you possibly know that? Because Usan Mar and Yulth Karn have both been quietly rewarded for what they did to my cadets, and their families sit closer to the hardline faction than Korvath's does, and somebody above Vray wants a cadet in that ring who will not hesitate the way Korvath started hesitating. She stood. I'd stake my rank on it, sir, and I want it on record, right now, before it happens, that I predicted it. Vray's assignment list came through 2 days later. It named Cadet Elias Ford. It named, as his senior in the demonstration proving, Cadet Usan Mar. Dessau read it once, standing alone in the human cohort's common room after the others had gone to evening mess, and felt something settle in her chest that was not fear and was not even quite anger anymore. 3/4 of a mission through. Something closer to the particular readiness she'd only ever felt in the hours before a plan she'd spent weeks building finally met the ground it had been built for. She calmed Elias in from mess early, sat him down, and did not soften what she told him. In 9 days, you're going to stand in that ring in front of the entire Concord delegation, and Usan Mar is going to try to make you the proof his faction wants, that a human cadet either breaks or has to be rescued by an officer who loses her composure doing it. Both of those outcomes end the ratification vote in their favor. I need you to understand exactly what you're walking into, and I need you to trust that I have already built the third outcome they haven't planned for. What's the third outcome? Elias asked, and for the first time in 11 weeks she heard, under the exhaustion, something that was not quite fear. You hold, she said. Longer than anyone in that ring believes a human can hold, on skills I've spent 11 weeks putting into your body until they don't need your mind's permission to work. You hold until the moment I decide it's over. And then I walk into that ring, in front of every witness the Concord brought with them, and I end it in a way nobody in that room will ever be able to call anything but exactly, precisely justified. The 9 days that followed were the hardest of the rotation, and Dessau spent every one of them the way she'd once spent the 9 days before a contested landing, awake before anyone else, asleep after everyone else, every hour accounted for. She did not train Elias to win the proving, because winning was not a category the ritual recognized when one side could never give the yield signal. She trained him to outlast it, which was a different discipline entirely, built less on strength than on the particular endurance of a body that had been taught, joint by joint, exactly how to absorb pressure without breaking under it. She drilled him on joint locks until he could recognize, blind purely by feel, the difference between a hold that was testing him and a hold that was 15 degrees from snapping something, because that 15 degrees, she told him, was the only threshold that mattered now, not pain, which the proving's rules permitted without limit, but structural damage, the one line even a rigged custom could not cross without triggering the mortal risk clause Vray himself had cited on her very first morning. The moment Usan crosses that line I move, she told him, for the 4th night running, both of them alone in the yard under station night lighting. Not before. If I move before, it's a human officer interrupting a legal custom in front of the entire Concord delegation, and we lose the argument even while we win the fight. If I move exactly when he crosses it, it's a human officer preventing an unlawful injury under statute that outranks any species' internal tradition, in front of the same delegation, and we win both. Do you understand the difference? I understand it, Elias said. I don't know if my body's going to understand it when it's happening. That's what the last 9 days are for. She reset his stance, checked his grip, ran the sequence again. Your body already knows more than you think it does. My job the next 9 days is just making sure your mind doesn't get in its way when it matters. She spent the other hours of those 9 days on a second track entirely, one she did not discuss with the cadets because it was not theirs to carry. She requested, through channels she had not used since the Threshold War, a formal review of MilitarySciFi's archived proving statutes, not the Academy's summary annex, which Vray had quoted her word for word on her first day, but the full original treaty language, drafted 40 years earlier when the Concord's founding species had first agreed to let member cultures retain internal disciplinary custom. It took 3 days and one favor called in from a fleet judge advocate she'd served alongside at Calder Ridge before she had it. A single clause, buried in the treaty's original interspecies safety appendix, stating plainly that any proving custom applied to a cadet physiologically incapable of producing that custom's yield signal was, by the treaty's own founding language, exempt from the non-intervention protection entirely, because the entire legal basis of non-intervention rested on the juniors' ability to end the exchange themselves, and a custom that removed that ability removed its own protection with it. Nobody at MilitarySciFi had ever needed to invoke that clause, because in 40 years no species without a compatible yield signal had ever been enrolled in the joint program. Humanity was the first. The hole in the rule was not an oversight. It could not have been an oversight, not with founding language this precise, sitting 3 appendices deep in an archive nobody, with the authority to change it had bothered to read in 4 decades. But it had also never been tested, which meant nobody currently serving at MilitarySciFi, not Vray, not Rays, not the delegation flying in to watch, had any idea it existed. She did not file it. She did not raise it with Rays, who would have felt obligated to escalate it through channels slow enough to miss the demonstration entirely. And she did not raise it with Vray, because she wanted the moment it surfaced to belong to the ring, in front of witnesses, not to a quiet memo 3 tiers removed from anyone who needed to feel its weight. She simply carried it, the way she'd once carried a route across open ground that nobody else on her element had bothered to scout, because sometimes the only good use for information was silence held exactly long enough to matter. On the 7th night, Vray found her at the yard alone, well past the hour any instructor had reason to be there. He did not speak for a long moment, standing at the yard's edge the way Corvath once had, and she let the silence run, because she had learned enough about Dren patience in 11 weeks to know that rushing him would cost her more than waiting. Calder Ridge, he said finally. The northern gully, 11 of my cadets in a single night, and I never once saw the position you fired from, not during the engagement and not in the 3 days afterward when I led the recovery team back over that ground myself. His throat sac was very quiet, very still. I told myself for 6 years that it did not matter who had held that position, because the war was over and the position no longer existed. I did not expect to spend a rotation walking past its owner in a training yard 3 mornings a week. I know who you are too, Marshal. I read your file the same night I read the treaty annex. Then you understand why I did not stop what has happened to your cadets sooner. It was not quite an apology. She had not expected one, not yet. I told myself it was tradition. I told myself the delegation's political calculus was not mine to interfere with. I think, if I am honest with the only person on this station who has any right to hear it, I told myself those things because it was easier than admitting that some part of me wanted to know whether your species could still be broken by something smaller than a war, now that the war was over and I had nothing left to measure you by. And now I have watched you build 5 cadets into something no proving in 40 years has ever produced, without once raising your voice, without once giving anyone a reason to say you did not respect this academy's custom, and I find I no longer want the answer to the question I spent 6 years asking. He inclined his skull, the full ritual gesture this time, weight and consequence and something that might in a Dren throat. have been the closest thing to grief. I cannot stop the demonstration, Sergeant. The assignment came from above me, and refusing it now would be read by the delegation as proof the Academy fears exactly the outcome it is designed to produce. But I want you to know that when it happens, I will not be standing at the edge of that ring with my arms folded, pretending I do not understand what I am watching. He left before she could answer, the same way Corvath had, and she stood alone in the cold a long while afterward, turning the exchange over, because an old enemy's honesty was a strange, heavy thing to be handed 9 days before a fight, and she intended to use every ounce of its weight. The attempt on the evidence itself came on the 6th night, and she had half expected it, which was the only reason it failed. She had kept the treaty appendix, the physical archive copy the fleet judge advocate had helped her pull, sealed in its own data case rather than filed on any Academy network a determined enough hand might quietly corrupt, in her own quarters rather than anywhere official, precisely because a document that could unmake a faction's entire political strategy was worth more to certain people missing than it was worth to her exposed too early. She woke at 0200 to the specific, deliberate quiet of a door lock cycling through an override sequence too slow and too careful to be a maintenance drone, and she was on her feet with the case already in her hand before the door had finished its second attempt. The cadet on the other side of it, when she opened the door herself rather than let him force it, was younger than Ussen, younger even than Elias, a first-year dren she did not immediately recognize, override tool still in one shaking hand, 3 eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who had been sent to do something he did not have the composure to actually do. "You're not going to hurt me," Dissas said, before he could decide whether to run or attempt to bluff his way past her, and she said it the way she'd once talked down recruits frozen on the wrong side of a live-fire line, flat, certain, no room in the tone for the panic to find purchase. "Put the tool down and tell me whose name is going to protect you from what happens to a cadet caught breaking into a fleet liaison officer's quarters, because I promise you it isn't the name of whoever sent you." He put the tool down. His name, it turned out, was Cadet Ussel Karn, a cousin's cousin of Yulth Karn's, close enough in the clan structure to have been leaned on by an uncle 2 tiers up the home delegation's hierarchy who had told him, in terms the boy repeated to her almost verbatim, once the fear finally broke into something closer to relief at being caught by someone who wasn't going to make it worse. That removing the human officer's copy of some old appendix nobody else has read would end the whole affair quietly, protect his family's standing, and never need to be spoken of again. She did not report him to Vray that night. She sat him down instead in her own quarters and made him tell her everything, which delegate had approached his uncle, what exactly he'd been told the appendix contained, whether anyone else had been asked to attempt something similar, and by the time she walked him back to his own dormitory an hour before dawn, she had a name to add to the picture she was quietly building of exactly how far Counselor Ganeth's faction was willing to reach to keep a 40-year-old blind spot from ever seeing daylight. And a frightened boy who understood, with a clarity his uncle had clearly not anticipated, that the human officer he'd been sent to rob had chosen not to end his career over one bad night, and that the debt of that choice was now his to carry rather than hers. "I'm not going to file this," she told him at his dormitory door in the gray pre-dawn light. "Not because it doesn't matter, because filing it makes you the story and you're 17, and your uncle is the one who should be answering for tonight, not you. But I want you to understand something before I let this go. Whatever they told you this would protect, it was never your family's standing. It was a rule that lets people like your uncle keep hurting cadets who can't ask it to stop. You almost helped keep that rule alive tonight. I don't think that's who you actually are, or you'd have finished the job instead of standing frozen in my doorway with your hand shaking on the tool." He didn't answer, not with words, but he didn't run either, and 3 days later, without her prompting, he submitted a quiet, unsolicited statement to the Academy's ethics registrar naming the uncle who'd sent him, not the full weight of what Ganeth's faction had attempted, which Ussel did not have visibility into, but enough, corroborated later by Nell's own careful digging through delegation correspondence logs, to become one more thread in the pattern the Concord Review would eventually pull whole. She told Vray about the break-in the next morning, because she had promised him honesty as the price of the ledger they were slowly, carefully closing between them, and because a drill marshal reassigned to training oversight still had authority over dormitory security that she did not. "You could have destroyed that boy's career with one report," Vray said when she finished. "I could have. It wouldn't have fixed anything that mattered. His uncle sent a frightened 17-year-old to do a coward's work because he assumed a human officer would react the way his own faction reacts, with force, or with vindictiveness, or with a report designed to end a career rather than correct a choice." She held Vray's eyes. "I've spent this whole rotation trying to teach 5 cadets that the difference between justice and cruelty is knowing exactly how much force a given moment actually requires. I wasn't going to abandon that lesson the first time it cost me something to keep it." Vray was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke, there was something in his voice she had not heard from him before, not quite admiration, closer to the particular respect one careful officer extends another across a divide neither had expected to close so completely. "I begin to understand, Sergeant, why an entire war's worth of my own people never once managed to break the discipline of the position you held at Calder Ridge. It was never simply training. It was this. Exactly this, applied without exception, regardless of the cost of applying it." She increased the household security on the appendix after that, a second sealed copy, filed this time through the Fleet Judge Advocate's own archive rather than kept anywhere on station, a fact she made certain, through channels careful enough not to trace back to Ussel, reached Ganeth's faction within the week, because the surest way to end an attempt at theft was to make the theft pointless rather than merely punished. No second attempt came. Whatever calculation Ganeth's people ran after that, it apparently concluded that the appendix was no longer worth the risk of reaching for, and the 6 remaining nights before the delegation's shuttles arrived passed with nothing worse than the ordinary exhaustion of 9 days, spent preparing a 19-year-old boy's body to hold a line his own species had never been built to signal the end of. The delegation arrived on the morning of the 9th day, 6 shuttles docking in sequence along the Academy's formal reception spine, disgorging representatives from every founding species of the Concord Compact, tall, robed Vashti diplomats with their careful, unreadable posture, a pair of Threndi elders whose skin had gone the deep blue-black of great age, 3 Alan scholars from the Historical Council, Nell Afrenia trailing at the edge of their delegation with a data slate she did not once put down. And at the center of the Dren contingent, an elder Dessa had not met before, robed in the deep gray ceremonial weave of the home delegation's ranking council, whom Vray introduced with visible reluctance as Overseer Thas Corin, the Concord's appointed arbiter for the joint program's compliance review. Reyes met the delegation at the spine with every ounce of diplomatic polish he had left, and Dessa watched him do it, the practiced warmth, the careful phrasing, the tour itinerary that walked the Concord observers past training halls and classrooms, and a specifically curated cross-section of interspecies cooperation designed, she understood without being told, to make the coming demonstration look like a single note in a much larger, healthier chord rather than the whole and rotten point of the visit. She kept her own cadets away from the delegation's public tour entirely, on the reasoning that the less exposure Elias had to the assembled weight of the audience before the ring, the more of his composure would still be intact when it mattered. She spent that morning instead running the same drills she'd run every morning for 11 weeks, unhurried, at the yard, in full view of anyone who cared to look, because a pattern unbroken on the day everything changed said more than any speech she could have given. The demonstration was scheduled for the Academy's central arena, a sunken circular ring 3 tiers below the atrium's glass dome, built to seat several hundred, and ringed that afternoon with every observer who mattered. The Concord delegation in the honored crescent nearest the ring floor, raised seated with visible tension 2 places down from Overseer Corin, cadets from every species packed into the tiers above. Drawn by the same current of rumor that had carried the Cartridge story through the academy weeks earlier. Dessa found Priya, Naomi, Devon, and Ito already seated together near the ring's edge when she arrived with Elias, close enough to see everything, far enough to stay out of the ritual's formal boundary, and she registered, with a small private satisfaction she did not let show on her face, that none of the 4 looked away when Mar entered from the opposite tunnel, to a low percussive click of approval from a cluster of Dren cadets seated behind Korvath's usual place. Korvath was seated, not standing at Ussan's side, not part of the ceremonial procession that should, by every custom she'd read, have flanked the senior cadet into the ring. He sat instead in the front tier beside 2 of his crew, arms folded, throat sack utterly silent, and when his eyes found hers across the ring floor he did not look away, and she understood the small, deliberate act of absence for exactly what it was. Vray stood at the ring's official station, in full ceremonial gray, and read the proving's opening formula in the low ritual cadence of a man performing a rite he no longer believed in. The terms of engagement, the conditions of yield, the assurance, delivered to the assembled Concord delegation in careful trade tongue, that this custom had governed Dren cadet discipline for 11 generations and would be conducted, as always, under full instructor supervision to ensure no participant came to lasting harm. Overseer Corin's flat, ancient voice carried from the honored crescent, "Proceed, drill marshal." Elias stepped into the ring. Dessa did not sit. She stood at the ring's edge, at the boundary the ritual permitted an officer to occupy without technically entering the ring itself, hands loose at her sides, weight even, and she made herself deliberately the stillest thing in that entire arena, not tense, not braced, simply present in a way that asked nothing of the room's attention and would, when the moment came, demand all of it. Mar crossed the ring floor at a controlled, unhurried pace that told her he had rehearsed this, that someone, she suspected the elder delegation seated nearest Corin, though she would never prove it, had coached him on exactly how to make cruelty look like ceremony for an audience of diplomats who wanted, more than anything, a demonstration clean enough to let them vote the way they'd already decided to vote. The first exchange was almost gentle, by the standards of what she'd trained Elias to absorb, a controlled grapple, a testing hold, the kind of opening the ritual's formal language actually described. Elias held it, breath even, exactly as drilled, and a small ripple of surprised murmuring moved through the tiers, because 11 weeks of quiet 0500 sessions had produced, in front of several hundred witnesses, a human cadet who did not flinch. Ussan's second hold was not gentle. He drove Elias to the ring floor with a shoulder strike disguised inside the ritual's formal grapple sequence, pinned his arm at an angle that made 2 Vashti diplomats in the crescent shift uncomfortably in their seats, and Dessa watched Elias' jaw lock, watched him find the breath discipline she drilled into him across 9 sleepless nights, watched him hold, not yield, not break, simply hold at an angle that was, by her own careful count, still 4 degrees short of the threshold that would trigger her. The tiers had gone very quiet. Even the cadets who had come expecting spectacle had not expected this particular kind of spectacle. A human cadet absorbing pressure without a sound, without a plea, without the collapse. An entire section of that audience had been quietly promised for 11 weeks. Ussan adjusted his grip. Dessa saw it before Elias' face registered it, the small shift in the senior cadet's shoulder that meant he'd read the room's silence not as awe but as an obstacle, and had decided, in the space of half a second, to solve it by escalating past whatever restraint the demonstration's staged choreography had originally called for. His grip crossed the threshold. Elias made a sound then, not a plea, not a scream, just the short, involuntary exhale of a joint moving somewhere it was not built to move, and Dessa was already walking. She did not run. She had not run in the receiving yard 11 weeks earlier, and she did not run now, because the entire architecture of what came next depended on every witness in that arena understanding, without a shadow of doubt, that what they were about to watch was control, not fury. She crossed the ring's boundary at exactly the moment its formal edge stopped mattering. Mortal risk clause, Vray's own words, the one exception the ritual itself allowed. And Mar, mid-motion, caught the change in the arena's air before he consciously registered the reason for it. Several hundred cadets had gone silent at once. That kind of silence had a texture. He felt it before he saw her. He looked up. She had already stopped moving. Dessa Akafer went still the way she had gone still on a frozen ridgeline 6 years and 1 war ago, the stillness that had once kept 11 Dren cadets from ever seeing the position that ended their night, not a held breath, not a tensed muscle, but the total, absolute absence of any signal a predator's eye was built to track. No shift of weight, no flicker of the hands. Her gaze found Ussen's and did not move, did not blink on the schedule a threat was supposed to blink on, and for 1 full second the entire arena watched a Dren cadet who had never once feared a human in his life go rigid at the ring's edge, his throat sac locking mid-click, the sound aborting somewhere in his chest. It was not magic. She could have explained it to him in plain words if there had been time, that 400 generations of his species had learned, on a world she would never see, exactly what it meant when the thing hunting them stopped moving entirely, that the stillness itself was the strike's first half, older and deeper than any lesson a Dren cadet had ever been taught in a classroom. She did not have time, and she did not need it, because his body had already answered a question his mind had not finished asking. His grip on Elia's arm loosened by degrees before he consciously chose to loosen it, some ancient part of him deciding, on its own authority, that whatever was standing at the ring's edge was not a shape to be tested. Elia's arm slipped free. He dropped, caught himself on his good hand, did not cry out. Dessa closed the remaining distance in 3 unhurried steps, and only then did her stillness resolve into motion. Fast, exact, economical in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with 30 years of knowing precisely how much force a given outcome required, and never once spending a gram more. She took Ussen's overextended arm at the wrist and the elbow, redirected his own forward momentum into the ring floor, and had him face down with his arm locked at the same shoulder joint he had just, 4 degrees past threshold, tried to dislocate in a 19-year-old boy, all inside 2 seconds, all without a single blow thrown. She held him there, not crushing, not punishing, controlled, the exact pressure a demonstration required to prove a point and not 1 degree more, because she had told Elias 9 days ago that the line between justified and savage was measured in exactly this kind of restraint, and she intended every soul in that arena to see her hold it. The arena did not make a sound. Several hundred cadets from 9 species sat frozen in the tears, and in the honored crescent overseer, Thas Corin had gone very still himself, ancient eyes fixed on the ring floor with an attention that had not been there 30 seconds earlier. It was Vray who moved first among the adults, crossing to the ring's edge with a speed that surprised even Dessa, and he did not raise his voice against her, did not order her to release the cadet. He stood beside her, faced the crescent, and spoke in the ritual cadence he had used to open the demonstration, except now his voice carried something it had not carried an hour earlier. "Mortal risk clause invoked," he said. The senior cadet exceeded the threshold governing joint contact under proving custom. The intervening officer's conduct is within statute. On what authority does a human officer determine the threshold of a Dren ritual she has held custody of for 11 weeks? A voice called from the delegation, not Corin, one of the seated elders behind him, robed in the same deep gray. The voice Dissa suspected, without proof, belonged to whoever had coached Ussan's rehearsed cruelty in the first place. Dissa answered before Vray could, still holding Ussan at exactly the pressure that had ended his escalation, and not a fraction more. "On the authority of the treaty language that created this program," she said, and her voice, for the first time since the receiving yard 11 weeks earlier, carried to every tier of the arena. "I'd like the overseer's permission to read it into record, if the delegation is willing to hear it." Silence answered her, which she took, correctly, as permission, and Overseer Corin's flat old voice finally broke it. "You may speak, Sergeant. The proving's non-intervention protection exists because the ritual is built on a junior's ability to end it themselves, at any point, through the yield signal, a subvocal click produced by a throat sac every species in this program was assumed to possess when the treaty's founding language was drafted 40 years ago." She did not raise her voice further. She did not need to. The arena had gone so quiet that every word carried on its own. No human cadet has ever been able to produce that signal, because no human throat is built to produce it. That was never in dispute, and Drill Marshal Vray confirmed it to me himself on my first morning on the station. What was never tested, because humanity is the first species enrolled in this program without a compatible yield signal, is what the treaty's own safety appendix says happens when that gap exists. She let that land, watching the delegation, watching Reyes go very still in his seat. The founding appendix states plainly that any custom applied to a cadet, physiologically incapable of producing that custom's yield signal, is exempt from non-intervention protection in full, because the entire legal basis for non-intervention rests on the junior's ability to end the exchange. A custom that removes that ability removes its own protection with it. She held Overseer Corin's ancient eyes. For 11 weeks, 5 human cadets on the station have been enrolled in a ritual with no mechanism by which they could ever, under any circumstance, make it stop. Cadet Ford could not have signaled yield 10 seconds before I crossed this ring's edge, no matter how much pain he was in, because his species was never given the anatomy the custom requires. That is not tradition, Overseer. That is a rule with a hole in it precisely the width of a human throat, and I would ask this delegation to consider, seriously, who benefited from nobody in 40 years bothering to read 3 appendices deep enough to find it, until it was human cadets standing in the gap. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Dissa felt it change texture the way she'd felt the arena change when she first crossed the ring's boundary. No longer the silence of an audience watching a spectacle, but the silence of several hundred witnesses realizing, all at once, that they had been shown exactly what the demonstration was designed to hide. Overseer Corin rose from the honored crescent, slow, deliberate, robes settling with the particular weight of ceremonial authority, and crossed to the ring's edge himself, close enough that Dissa could see the deep creases of extreme age along his hide, could see eyes that had watched, she suspected, more treaty violations argued in more council chambers than any other soul in that arena. "Release the cadet," he said, not an accusation, an instruction delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had already decided which version of this event he intended to carry back to the Concord assembly. Dissa released Ussan Mar, who scrambled up, favoring the shoulder, throat sac silent, and did not look at anyone in the tiers as he was quietly guided from the ring by a proctor Dissa had not noticed arrive. Corin turned to Vray. "Drill Marshal, is the treaty language the sergeant has cited accurate to your knowledge of the founding appendix?" Vray did not hesitate, and Dissa understood, watching him, exactly how much it cost a Dren officer to answer this question in front of his own home delegation, and exactly why he answered it anyway. "It is accurate, Overseer. I have read the appendix myself in the last 9 days, having been given reason to look for it. I did not know of its exemption clause before that." I do not believe anyone currently serving at this academy did, which does not excuse how long it has taken one of us to look. And the equipment incident during the wilderness evaluation, 6 weeks past, the one the safety review has been unable to resolve. Corin's eyes had not left Vray's. Was that, in your professional judgment, an isolated failure or a pattern this academy chose not to see clearly? The question hung in the arena for a long moment before Vray answered, and when he did, his voice carried to every tier, flat and final, the voice of a man setting down a weight he had carried 6 years too long. A pattern, overseer. I regret that it took a human officer with more patience than I deserved to make me look at it honestly. Overseer Corin did not deliver a full ruling from the ring floor. Concord procedure, Dessa would learn later, required a formal review convened within 72 hours of any incident touching treaty language, with every affected party present and every species entitled to submit testimony. But he said enough, standing at the ring's edge with the entire arena still holding its breath, to make clear which direction that review would run. This delegation came to Meridian Spire to observe whether the Joint Cadet Program functioned as this academy has represented it to the Concord Assembly for 6 years, he said, his flat old voice reaching every tier without effort. We have observed instead that it has not through malice alone, though I do not discount malice where I have seen it, but through a treaty gap left unexamined for 40 years because no species until this one has ever needed it examined. That failure is the Concord's, not any single cadets or officers. I intend to say so plainly in the review I file, and I intend to recommend the exemption clause the sergeant cited be written explicitly into every joint program's operating statute before another species enrolls beneath a custom that cannot hear them yield. He turned, slow, robe settling, and found Dessa's eyes across the small space still separating them. I have sat on Concord compliance panels for longer than your species has held a treaty with mine, Sergeant Akafer. I have rarely seen an officer wait as long as you waited, or move as precisely as you moved, when the moment finally required it. His crest, she had not noticed until now that Dren elders retained a vestigial ridge along the skull that Nell had once described to her as an echo of the same predator ancestry as the throat sac lifted slightly. A gesture she did not yet have a translation for but understood, from the way the tears around her seemed to exhale, was not a small thing. I do not know if that patience can be taught to every officer who will need it in the years ahead, as your species' role in this Concord grows past provisional. I know it should be studied. He did not wait for a response. He returned to the honored crescent, and the formal proceedings of the demonstration, what remained of them, dissolved into the controlled chaos of proctors clearing the ring, delegates conferring in low, urgent voices, and several hundred cadets beginning, all at once, to talk. Rays found her before she'd left the ring floor, and for the first time in 11 weeks, he did not look like a man managing a crisis. He looked, standing there in his good diplomatic coat with his hands not quite steady at his sides, like a man who had just watched someone else do the thing he'd spent 4 years telling himself was impossible. I told you if you moved before the threshold, you'd hand them the argument, he said, quiet just for her. You told me you'd wait for the moment they couldn't slide off a calendar. I did. I didn't fully believe you'd get one. He glanced past her at Elias, upright now, arm braced but on his feet, flanked by Priya and Naomi and Devon and Ito, none of them saying much, all of them standing close in a way that told her everything about what 11 weeks had built in that cramped common room. I've spent 4 years in this office telling myself the only responsible choice was patience dressed up as caution. I think I owe every cadet on this station an apology for how long it took someone from outside this office to show me the difference. You can start by making sure the review Corin files doesn't quietly stall the way the safety boards did. I intend to hand carry it myself. He said it with a conviction she had not heard from him once in 11 weeks, and she believed him, because a man did not find that particular tone by accident, 3 hours after watching a treaty gap exposed in front of the body that had the power to close it. Corveth was waiting near the tunnel mouth when she finally walked the cadets out of the arena, alone, arms uncrossed for once, and he did not speak to her first. He looked at Elias. "You held," he said, and there was something in the flat statement that was not quite admiration and was not quite apology, but sat somewhere honest between the two. "I did not think a human body could hold that long against a Dren senior at full intent. I am glad I was wrong." Elias, bracing his arm, managed something close to a smile. "Wasn't sure I'd hold either. Turns out somebody spent 9 nights making sure my body didn't need to ask my permission." Corveth's eyes moved to Dissa, and this time the look held none of the wary calculation of the receiving yard. "I told you once I did not know what I believed about your species, Sergeant. I believe now that I have spent my entire cadet career being taught to fear the wrong things." He inclined his skull, full ritual weight, the same gesture Vray had given her in the yard 9 days earlier. "I do not know what recompense a Dren owes for 11 weeks of silence while his crew hunted cadets who could never call for the custom to stop. I would like to begin finding out, if you will allow it. Start by telling the truth every time someone asks you what you saw," Dissa said. "That's worth more to me right now than any gesture you could make." "I intend to." He looked past her once more at the 5 cadets gathered behind her, and something in his posture shifted, not quite deference, closer to the beginning of respect earned rather than assumed. "For what it is worth. I do not think any of you are small anymore. I am not certain I ever should have believed you were." The formal Concord review convened 71 hours later, in a chamber 3 tiers above the arena that Dissa had not known existed, until Rays walked her to it. A circular room ringed with seating for every species delegation, a raised dais at its center for testimony, and notably, an open gallery above for any cadet or instructor who wished to observe, which told her something about how seriously Overseer Corin intended this particular proceeding to be seen. She testified first, at Corin's request, and kept her account exactly as spare as every report she'd filed across 11 weeks, dates, injuries, the cartridge telemetry, the treaty appendix, nothing embellished, nothing omitted. Vray testified after her, and did not soften his own culpability, laying out in flat, correct trade tongue every instance across the rotation where he had chosen the comfortable reading of a rule over the honest one, and closing with a request that surprised her, that his own name be entered into the review's record not as a witness, but as a party subject to disciplinary review himself, for negligence in his oversight duties. "I do not ask for leniency," he told the assembled delegations, his throat sack utterly still. "I ask only that whatever judgment falls on Cadet Marr and Cadet Karn fall equally on the officer who allowed the conditions that made their conduct possible. A student does not invent a loophole in a 40-year-old treaty on his own. He is handed one by adults who should have known better, and I was one of those adults." The hardline delegate who had challenged Dissa's authority from the Crescent. She learned his name during the proceeding, Counselor Threll Ganeth, senior political officer of the Dren Home delegation, argued for 2 hours that the entire incident represented an isolated failure of 2 individual cadets, rather than any structural flaw in proving custom, and that amending 40 years of treaty language over a single demonstration risked, in his words, rewriting the foundations of interspecies trust based on one species' inability to adapt to customs older than its own spacefaring history. Elias testified after Vray, at Corin's direct request rather than Dissa's suggestion, and she watched him climb to the small raised dais with the same steadiness he'd carried into the ring 9 days earlier. No brace on his arm now, nothing in his posture asking the room for sympathy he had not come there to collect. "I'm not here to tell you it hurt," he told the assembled delegations, plain, unhurried. Everyone in this chamber already knows it hurt. I'm here to tell you that for 11 weeks, I never once had a way to make it stop myself, and that the reason I didn't die on that ridge, or in that ring, wasn't the custom's own safeguards working the way this academy has represented them to the Concord for 40 years. It was one officer's willingness to stand at the edge of a rule until the exact legal moment she was permitted to cross it, and I would ask this delegation to consider how many cadets, on how many other stations, might not have had an officer willing to wait that carefully, or that long, if the gap in that rule had never been found at all. He paused, and when he continued, his voice hadn't wavered once. I don't want anyone's pity for what happened to me this rotation. I want the hole closed so the next cadet who can't signal yield doesn't need to get lucky the way I did. Counselor Ganeth did not cross-examine him. Dessau understood, watching the counselor's posture from across the chamber, that he had recognized correctly that any question he asked a calm 19-year-old who refused to perform either anger or fragility would only cost his own argument more ground than it might ever recover. It was Nell Afrenia, called from the gallery at Corin's invitation as the Academy's own archival historian, who answered that argument most completely, laying out for the review, in patient, exact detail, the original founding language of the safety appendix and the 6 other joint program incidents across Concord history, none involving humans, all involving smaller procedural gaps, where a similar exemption clause had been invoked without controversy the moment it was found to apply. The treaty was never designed to protect tradition at the cost of a cadet's ability to end their own suffering, she said, crest lifted, voice steady in front of a room 3 sizes larger than any she'd addressed before. It was designed to protect tradition precisely because that ability was assumed to always exist. Counselor Ganeth is not defending the treaty's foundations. He is defending an accident the treaty's authors never intended, and calling it heritage because heritage is harder to argue against than an accident. Corin's written ruling came 4 days later, and it did not leave room for ambiguity. Cadet Usain Mar was expelled from Meridian Spire Academy, disciplinary record permanently annotated, with a formal notation barring reinstatement at any Concord institution for a period of 10 years. Cadet Yulth Karn received the same, on the strength of the wilderness evaluation telemetry that the safety review had somehow found, in the changed political weather following the arena, entirely conclusive after all. Drill Marshal Austin Vray was formally reprimanded and reassigned from cadet discipline to a training oversight role with no direct authority over proving custom, a demotion he accepted, Dessau was told, without a single word of protest. And the treaty's founding safety appendix was ordered rewritten, effective immediately, to state explicitly what 40 years of unread language had implied all along, that any species enrolled in a joint disciplinary custom without the physiological means to end that custom on their own terms stood, from that moment and forever after, entirely outside its non-intervention protection. Counselor Ganeth did not accept the ruling quietly. Dessau learned this 2 days after the review closed, when Nell Afrenia found her at the yard before dawn, crest low, voice careful in the way that told Dessau the Alan had come with something she debated whether to share at all. Ganeth has filed a formal petition with the home delegation to have your posting recalled, Nell said. Not on any charge that would survive scrutiny. He cannot argue you violated statute, not after Corin's ruling. He is arguing instead that your presence here has become, in his language, a destabilizing symbol, and that fleet should reassign you before the ratification vote, quietly, in the name of avoiding further controversy. Meaning he wants me gone before I can testify at the assembly itself. Meaning exactly that. Nell's black eyes held hers steady. I do not know if the petition will succeed, Sergeant. I know Ganeth has spent 6 years building influence for precisely this kind of maneuver, and I know he will not stop simply because the arena went against him. Dessa considered that for a long moment, in the cold pre-dawn air, watching her breath fog the way it had on her very first morning at Meridian Spire. "Let him file it," she said finally. "I didn't come here to keep a posting, Nell. I came here to make sure 5 cadets got a fair fight, and they got one. If Fleet wants to recall me the day after a Concord arbiter rules the treaty itself was broken in my cadets' favor, that's a decision Fleet will have to explain to a lot of people who were sitting in that arena's tiers. I'd almost welcome the argument." The recall petition surfaced publicly 6 days later, and Dessa watched it die exactly the way she'd predicted, though not from anything she did herself. It died because Commandant Aldous Reyes, who had spent 4 years perfecting the art of careful, defensible caution, stood in front of the same Concord assembly that would soon vote on humanity's ratification, and delivered, without a single diplomatic hedge, a formal statement into the record opposing the recall in terms sharp enough that 2 members of his own senior staff told Dessa afterward they had never heard him speak that way in all his years on station. Sergeant Acaffer did not destabilize this academy, Reyes told the assembly. She revealed a destabilization that had been quietly tolerated for 11 weeks by people, myself included, who told ourselves caution and cowardice were the same virtue wearing different names. If this delegation wishes to recall the officer who found the courage the rest of us lacked, it should say so plainly, and let the record show exactly what kind of caution it was defending. The petition was withdrawn within the week. Councillor Ganeth did not appear at the next 3 sessions of the Assembly, and when he finally did, he raised no further objection to the treaty amendment, or to the officer who had forced it into daylight. The weeks between the ruling and the ratification vote settled into something Dessa had not expected to find at Meridian Spire: quiet. Not stillness in the way she'd trained it into Naomi, not the loaded absence of the yard before Vray's slow retreat from his old perimeter route. Ordinary quiet, the kind a station found when a wound finally stopped being picked at. The 0500 sessions kept running, but the audience at the yard's edge grew past curiosity into something closer to habit. A handful of Threndy cadets began arriving early enough to run the warm-up laps alongside the humans, not out of any grand gesture, but because, as one of them told Priya with the flat practicality of her species, matching another cohort's discipline was simply efficient training. Corvath came more mornings than not, and after the second week he stopped standing at the edge and started stepping onto the mats, working grappling sequences opposite Priya, and Ito with the careful, deliberate restraint of someone determined never again to be the reason approving needed a treaty clause to end it. Elia's arm came out of its brace in the 4th week after the arena, and the first thing he did with 2 working hands was ask Dessa to teach him the joint lock sequence she'd used on us and Mar, not out of any hunger for revenge. He told her plainly, but because he never wanted to be on the wrong end of not knowing it again. She taught him. She taught all 5 of them, in time, along with a dozen other things the Academy's official curriculum had never once considered relevant to a species it hadn't expected to enroll. How to read the specific silence of a dren throat sac gone still with genuine respect rather than calculation. How to recognize the difference in an Allen's crest lift between surprise and warning. Small fluent pieces of a much larger alphabet that Nell Afrenia, increasingly a fixture at the yard's edge herself, was only too glad to help translate. Naomi's stillness drills became, without anyone quite planning it, something like a minor legend among the Academy's medical track. After a Threndy instructor watched her hold a 20-minute static position without a single measurable tremor, and asked, with genuine professional curiosity, whether human physiology could be trained to that discipline broadly, or whether the girl in front of him was simply unusual. Dessa let Naomi answer that one herself, and the girl's answer, quiet, exact, delivered without a trace of the fear that had colored her voice on Dessa's first night in that cramped common room, was the kind of thing Dessa filed away as proof, if she'd still needed any, that 11 weeks had built something in these 5 cadets that no review board or treaty clause could have manufactured on its own. "It's trainable," Naomi told the instructor. "Most things people call natural talent are just training somebody hasn't watched happen yet." Priya's engineering project, a redesign of the Wilderness Bay's cartridge tracking telemetry, submitted, pointedly, under her own name 3 weeks after the review closed, was adopted by the Academy Safety Board without amendment, the first joint program safety proposal in Meridian Spire's history credited to a first-year cadet, human or otherwise. Devon's wrist healed clean, and he spent his convalescence buried in the trade-tongue linguistics text Nell brought him, emerging from 6 weeks in a brace fluent enough in formal Dren's ceremonial speech to startle Vray into something Dissa was fairly sure was the closest a Dren officer's face ever came to a smile. Ito's knee, examined properly for the first time by a specialist Dissa had requisitioned rather than the Academy's own overworked sick bay, turned out to carry an old fracture that had never fully set. It was corrected in a 2-day procedure that left him, for the first time in a year, able to run a full lap without favoring it. None of it made the front of any Concord bulletin. None of it needed to. Dissa had stopped, somewhere in the 11 weeks before the arena, measuring victory by what made the bulletins. The ratification assembly convened on the appointed day in the Concord's central chamber, a vast amphitheater on the station's forward hub that Dissa had never entered before, and walking into it now with all 5 cadets seated in the observers' gallery behind her at her own quiet insistence, understood immediately why every species treated with something close to reverence. Delegates from every founding world sat in tiered arcs beneath a domed sky window 3 times the size of the Academy's own, and when the vote was finally called, full and permanent Concord membership for the Terran Compact, no longer provisional, no longer subject to review, the tally rose across the chamber's central display species by species, faction by faction, and Dissa watched it climb without once reaching for the cadets behind her, because she had told them, months ago, that she did not say things she did not mean, and she had meant, from the very first morning, that this was theirs to watch happen rather than hers to celebrate on their behalf. The vote passed by a margin wide enough that even Councillor Ganeth's faction, when the final tally settled, did not bother forcing a formal objection into the record. Overseer Corin found her afterward in the crowded chamber corridor, delegates from 9 species moving past them in the particular controlled excitement of an institution that had just settled a question it had carried, unresolved, for 6 years. "I have sat on this council through 4 ratification votes in my lifetime, Sergeant," he said. "I have never once seen a margin move as far in the final weeks as this one moved. I do not think that is coincidence. I think a great many delegates who arrived undecided watched, very carefully, what happened in an arena 11 weeks into a rotation, and drew their own conclusions about what kind of species asks this little for itself and still refuses to be broken. I didn't do it for the vote, Overseer. I did not imagine you had." His crest lifted, the same small gesture she still did not have a full translation for, though she had come, by now, to recognize it as something like respect. "That, Sergeant, is precisely why it worked." The relay footage of the vote reached Terra 11 hours later, delayed by the ordinary lag of interstellar transmission, and Dissa did not think much about what it would mean back home until Elias found her at the yard 2 mornings after, data slate in hand, an expression on his face she hadn't seen from him before, not the guarded steadiness he'd worn since the arena, but something looser, younger, closer to the 19 he actually was. "My father saw it," he said, "the vote coverage. Apparently half of it got picked up by the civilian networks back home, the treaty amendment story especially. Some journalists dug up the whole arena footage from the Concord's own public archive before anyone thought to keep it quiet." He held the slate out, and she read the short message on it herself, a handful of lines, plain, unpolished, The kind of message a man wrote when he had a great deal to say and had decided most of it didn't need saying. Watched the footage 3 times. Your co doesn't flinch. Neither do you anymore. Proud of you, son. Your grandfather would have called that officer a soldier's soldier and meant it as the highest thing he knew how to say. He served, Elia said before she could ask. 22 years, planetary defense, retired before I was old enough to really understand what any of it cost him. He doesn't talk about it much. That message is more than he said to me about any of it in about 6 years. How does that land hearing it? Elias considered the question with the same care he'd learned to give every question across the rotation. Strange. Good strange. I think I spent most of my life assuming the only way to make him proud was to survive something the way he had, and I never really understood what that meant until I was standing in that ring wondering if my arm was about to come apart in front of a few hundred witnesses. He looked out at the yard, at Priya and Naomi running a grappling sequence in the pale early light. I don't think I would have held, if you hadn't spent 9 nights teaching my body what holding actually meant, instead of just telling me to be brave and hoping that was enough. Bravery's not nothing. It's just not sufficient on its own. Your father knew that, or he wouldn't have written it that way instead of just saying he was proud you didn't get hurt. She watched him fold the slate away, carefully, the way a man kept something he intended to read again on a harder day. Tell him something for me if you write back. What's that? Tell him the officer who taught you didn't do anything he wouldn't have recognized from his own service. I didn't invent patience, Elias. Every generation of us that's worn a uniform has had to relearn it from scratch, usually the hard way. I just happened to be the one standing in your yard when it was your turn to learn it. Priya's family message arrived the same week, longer, warmer, written by a mother who had spent the whole rotation quietly terrified every time a comm from Meridian Spire went unanswered for more than a day, and who wrote now, in the aftermath of the vote and the arena footage both, with the particular relief of a parent who had finally been allowed to stop bracing for the worst without ever having been told why she needed to. Naomi's family sent nothing at all, which Desan noted without comment, filing it away the way she filed everything that mattered to the 5 of them, understanding without needing to ask that some homes carried their own quiet weight that a rotation at Meridian Spire had not been built to fix, only to make a little more bearable by giving the girl who lived under it somewhere else to stand tall. Devon's parents sent a joint message that consisted mostly of technical questions about Dren's ceremonial linguistics, which made him laugh out loud in the common room for the first time Desa had heard since her arrival, and Ito's older sister sent a single line that the boy read to the room with unabashed pride. Beat the Academy's 3-year record. Please tell me you rubbed it in even a little. He had not, in fact, rubbed it in at all, and Desa was quietly, considerably proud of that restraint too, though she let the cadets have the moment of laughter without saying so. Later that night, once the others had drifted off to their bunks and the common room had gone quiet, Desa found Naomi still awake at the small table by the window, not reading anything, just watching the slow turn of the stars the way she'd watched them the very first night, though nothing else about the way she held herself matched that first night at all. You don't have to tell me anything about home, Desa said, sitting across from her, keeping her voice as even as she'd have kept it discussing a training schedule. I noticed the silence. I'm not asking you to fill it. I just don't want you thinking I didn't see it. Naomi was quiet a long moment, turning something over that had clearly been turned over many times before Desa ever arrived at Meridian Spire. It's not a story that needs an arena, Sergeant. It's smaller than that. It's just a house that never once made me feel like holding still was a skill worth having instead of a habit I picked up defending myself. She looked up, and there was nothing broken in her face, only a kind of tired honesty that Desa recognized from 30 years of debriefing soldiers who had finally decided a room was safe enough to say something true in. This is the first place that ever told me the stillness was a strength instead of just how I survived long enough to leave. It was always a strength. You just needed somewhere that could see it clearly enough to say so. I know that now. Naomi's mouth curved, small, real. I don't think I'll forget who taught me, even after you're 3 systems out teaching somebody else's frightened cadet the same thing. I'm counting on it, Dessa said, and meant it, and let the quiet after that stand for everything neither of them needed to say aloud to make it true. She thought, watching the 5 of them pass the messages between themselves in the common room that evening, about the particular arithmetic of a war fought correctly. How little of it, in the end, ever showed up in the official record, and how much of it lived instead in a father's 6-word sentence about a soldier's soldier, or a mother finally allowed to stop bracing, or a sister's joke about rubbing a record in. Fleet would remember the arena and the treaty amendment. These 5 would remember, she suspected, mostly this, an ordinary evening, messages from home, 5 people who had earned the right to simply sit in a room together without flinching at the sound of a door. The margin at the assembly did not end Councillor Ganeth's campaign so much as change its shape. Dessa learned this from Vray himself, 3 days after the vote, when he requested a formal meeting through channels rather than simply finding her at the yard, a small courtesy she understood by now, as his way of signaling that what he had to say carried enough weight to deserve the ceremony of an appointment. Ganeth cannot reverse the vote, Vray told her, in the training oversight office he'd been reassigned to, a smaller room than his old station, no less orderly for its size. He is instead attempting to delay the treaty amendment's implementation date by filing a procedural motion for further study. 6 months, he is arguing, to properly assess the exemption clause's application across all Concord institutions before it takes binding effect anywhere. 6 months would put implementation past the start of next rotation's cadet enrollment. It would, which means any species without a compatible yield signal enrolling at any joint academy in the Concord during those 6 months would enroll under the old rule, under the rule with the hole in it. Vray's throat sac was very quiet. It is a smaller maneuver than the recall petition. It is also, I believe, more dangerous because it does not attack you directly. It attacks the fix itself, and it is dressed carefully enough in the language of due diligence that I am not certain the Assembly will see through it as quickly as they saw through Ganeth's first attempt. What's the counter? I have already begun drafting one. As the officer of record who identified and corrected the safety failure in my own command, I am entitled to petition for expedited implementation on my academy's authority alone, without waiting for a Concord-wide study. A narrow provision, rarely used, but binding if the compliance board accepts it. He slid a data slate across the desk toward her, dense with formal Dren administrative language she could not fully parse without Nell's help. I intend to file it within the day. I wanted you to see it before I did, because I suspect Ganeth's people will move to discredit it as a demotion-scarred officer's attempt to salvage his own record, and I would rather you hear the honest version from me than the ungenerous one from him. She read what she could of it, slow, careful. Is that what this is, salvaging your record? Vray was quiet a long moment, and when he answered, it was with the particular flatness of a Dren officer, choosing not to dress a hard truth in anything softer than it deserved. I buried 11 cadets at Calder Ridge and told myself for 6 years that the war which killed them was simply larger than any single officer's judgment, and there was nothing more for me to carry than grief. He did not look away from her. I have since learned that judgment is not absolved by the size of the war around it. I did not act on what I knew about your cadets soon enough, and 11 weeks of small cruelties happened that a braver officer would have stopped in the first week. I am not filing this petition to salvage a record, Sergeant. I am filing it because I finally understand the difference between surviving a war honorably and simply surviving it, and I would like, for whatever years remain to me, to be the kind of officer who does the first. The petition was filed that afternoon. It was contested for 11 days, Ganeth's faction producing 3 separate procedural objections, each slower and more technical than the last, each answered in turn by a coalition Dessa had not built herself and had not expected to see assemble on its own. Ray's filing supporting testimony from the Academy's diplomatic office. Nell Afrenia submitting a formal historical brief, cross-referencing every prior instance of an expedited safety petition in Concord archive. And on the 9th day, an unsolicited statement from Overseer Thas Corin himself entered into the Compliance Board's record without any request from Dessa or Vray at all, stating simply that he had personally witnessed the conditions the amendment was meant to correct, and that any further delay in binding it would be. In his professional judgment as the Concord's senior arbiter for joint program compliance, a decision this council will regret explaining to whatever cadet is harmed in the interval it purchased for procedural comfort. The Compliance Board ruled in Vray's favor on the 12th day. The amendment took binding effect across every joint academy in the Concord within the week, 6 months ahead of the study Ganeth had proposed, and Dessa read the ruling standing at the yard's edge in the pale early light, 5 cadets running warm-up laps behind her, and felt something settle in her chest that was, for the first time since she'd stepped off that shuttle 11 weeks and 1 arena ago, something close to simple relief. It was not, she understood, the end of every fight this particular corner of the Concord would ever have. Ganeth's faction did not vanish. Hardline politics rarely vanished so much as changed targets and waited. But the hole in the rule was closed now, not just for 5 cadets on one station, but for every species that would ever again enroll in a Concord academy without the anatomy its founders had assumed everyone possessed. And she understood, reading the ruling a second time in the cold morning air, that this was the actual shape of the victory she'd come here to win. Not a single arena, not a single boys held arm, but a door closed permanently behind cadets who would never know her name. On academies she would never visit, because a Dren officer with an old debt and a human sergeant with older patience had refused to let a treaty's 40-year-old blind spot survive one more rotation unexamined. The first proof of it reached her 6 weeks later. In a routine fleet liaison bulletin, she almost skimmed past before the second paragraph caught her eye. A joint academy on a station 3 systems distant had enrolled its first cohort of Kyrnthi cadets, a species Dessa had never heard of before that morning, aquatic, communicative through pressure wave, pulses their gill structures produced, and physically incapable. The bulletin noted in the flat administrative language of a report, never meant to be read as anything but routine, of producing the vocalized yield signal required by that academy's own internal disciplinary custom. Under the amendment's new standing language, the exemption applied automatically, cited by statute number rather than argued case by case, and the bulletin closed with a single line that Dessa read 3 times before she set the slate down. No incident to report. Custom modified prior to first cadet placement, per Concord-wide Statute 14.3a, amended. No incident to report. 5 words that had cost 11 weeks, a boy's dislocated shoulder, a girl's near-fatal night on a frozen ridge, and an old soldier's willingness to finally look honestly at a war he'd spent 6 years trying not to remember. And on some station 3 systems away, cadets she would never meet were simply enrolling under a rule that had already been fixed before it could ever be used against them. A second bulletin followed the first by only 9 days, this one from an academy closer to home, in the same sector as Meridian Spire itself, a small joint training facility that had, buried in its own routine quarterly compliance filing, quietly noted an amended disciplinary custom for a newly enrolled cohort of silicate-based cadets whose crystalline vocal structures had never been capable of producing any species standard yield signal at all, human or otherwise. A gap that had apparently sat unexamined in that academy's own tradition for over a decade before the Concord-wide statute, finally forced someone to look. Dessa read that one twice as well, standing at the same yard's edge where she'd read the first, and found herself thinking less about the treaty language this time, and more about how many quiet, unremarkable rooms across the Concord had been carrying gaps like that one for years, decades, in some cases, simply because no one with the authority to look had ever been given a reason urgent enough to bother. She had not set out, 11 weeks earlier, to become that reason. She had set out to keep 5 specific cadets from being broken by a rule nobody with power had wanted to examine closely enough to fix. That the fixing had rippled this far, this fast, into rooms she would never see, on stations she would never visit, struck her now as the truest measure of what the whole rotation had actually been worth. Not the arena, not the vote, not even the quiet closing of an old soldier's 6-year ledger, but this. A silicate cadet somewhere in the same sector, enrolling this week under a custom that could finally hear them, because a Cairnthai bulletin and a human sergeant's stubborn patience had, between them, made silence like that a little harder for the whole Concord to keep affording. She showed the bulletin to Elias that evening, at the yard, the two of them alone after the others had gone in for evening mess. "That's it," he said, reading it over twice himself. "That's the whole thing. Nobody there's ever going to know what happened here." "No. Doesn't that bother you, nobody ever knowing?" Dessa considered the question with the same care she gave every question these 5 had learned across a rotation that she would never answer lazily. The point was never for anyone to know, Elias. The point was for the whole to close. If I'd needed credit for it to feel finished, I'd have picked the wrong reason to do it in the first place. She nodded at the slate in his hands. "That's the actual ending, not the arena. This. Some cadet on a station will never see, who never has to learn what it feels like to stand in a ring with no way to make it stop, because 5 people here held on long enough to make sure the rule got fixed before they got there." He was quiet a moment, turning that over, and when he spoke again his voice had the particular steadiness she'd first heard in Naomi, months ago, in a cramped common room the night Dessa promised 5 frightened cadets she didn't say things she didn't mean. "I think I understand now," he said, "why you never let us go after Usin personally, why the training was never about winning the fight." "Tell me." "Because the fight was never actually the thing. The fight was just where the thing became visible enough for someone with the authority to fix it to finally look at it." He handed the slate back. "You weren't training us to survive a bully, Sergeant. You were training us to be the kind of witnesses nobody could dismiss when the moment finally needed one. That's the most honest thing anyone on this station has said to me in 11 weeks, Dessa said, and meant it, and did not soften the small, real pride in her voice, because he had earned hearing it plainly. Vray sought her out one final time before the rotation's formal close. On a morning she had not expected him at the yard at all, standing at the edge with none of his old ceremonial reserve, hands loose at his sides in a posture she'd never once seen from him. "I have a request, Sergeant, and I would understand if you refuse it." He held something in one four-jointed hand, a small dark object she could not identify from a distance, worn smooth in a way that suggested long handling. "It is a Dren custom older than the proving, older than this academy, the closing of a ledger between 2 officers who once stood on opposite sides of a war neither chose, when both have come to believe the debt between them is settled honestly rather than merely expired. I did not think I would ever have cause to perform it. I did not expect the cause when it came, to be a rotation spent watching you protect 5 cadets more carefully than I protected the 11 I lost." He opened his hand. The object was a small carved marker, Dren script worked into its surface, and he offered it to her the way she imagined a soldier of his species offered very little with both hands, head slightly bowed, the full weight of 11 weeks and 6 years and one frozen ridgeline behind the gesture. "I'm not asking forgiveness for Calder Ridge, Sergeant. War does not require forgiveness between soldiers who fought it honestly, only acknowledgement that it is finished. I am asking whether you believe, having watched me across this rotation, that the debt between the officer who lost 11 cadets to the still ones and the still one who took them is now closed on terms we can both carry without shame. Desai looked at the marker for a long moment, and then at the old soldier holding it out to her, scarred jaw, patient black eyes, a man who had spent a war trying to kill her and a rotation trying to become someone worth standing beside instead. She took the marker. "It's closed," she said, "not because the 11 you lost don't matter, because you spent this rotation proving you never forgot that they did, and you did something with that memory besides carry it alone." She closed her hand around the small carved weight. "That's the only kind of closing a ledger like that should ever get, Marshal. Not forgetting. Doing better with what the weight taught you." Vray inclined his skull, the full ritual gesture, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Two soldiers from opposite sides of a war 6 years cold, standing in the pale morning light of a training yard that had, across one difficult rotation, quietly become something neither of them had expected it to become. The Academy's end-of-rotation review fell 3 weeks after that, a formal ceremony held in the same central atrium, where Desai had first met Commandant Reyes beneath the pale stone and the turning stars. Cadets from every species stood in ranked lines by discipline track, and for the first time since MilitarySciFi's joint program had been founded, the human cohort was not tucked into the smallest, farthest corner of the formation but placed, by Reyes' own explicit order, alongside the other first-year tracks in the order their marks actually earned. Priya's telemetry redesign was cited by name in the Safety Board's closing report, read aloud to the full assembly by a Threndi administrator who stumbled slightly over the human syllables of her surname, and did not seem to mind being corrected, gently, by 2 Alan cadets standing near enough to help. Naomi was invited formally to shadow the Academy's senior medical staff for the coming rotation. The first human cadet ever extended that invitation. On the strength of a steadiness, 3 different instructors had independently flagged as remarkable regardless of species. Devon's fluency in formal Dren ceremonial speech earned him a place on the cadet delegation assigned to greet the next incoming rotation's arrivals, a duty that had never once, in MilitarySciFi's history, been given to a first year. Ito ran the closing ceremony's traditional endurance lap, a full circuit of the outer ring corridor, 6 kilometers, timed and posted for every cadet on station to see, in a time that beat the Academy's own 3-year record for a first-year cadet by a margin. The posted results simply listed as *significant*, because whoever compiled the board apparently hadn't trusted the number enough to phrase it any other way. Naomi's first day shadowing the medical staff began the following morning, before the rest of the ceremony's afterglow had even fully settled, because the senior Threndi physician overseeing the rotation had apparently decided a cadet with that kind of steadiness had no business waiting a full cycle to start earning it. Desai found her afterward at the yard, still in her borrowed medical whites, exhausted in the particular way of someone who had spent a full shift being useful rather than simply present. "First real case?" Desai asked. "A Kyrnthi transfer student, actually, if you can believe it, passing through en route to her own posting, minor pressure organ strain from the station's gravity differential." Naomi allowed herself something close to a real smile, rare enough on her that Desai noted it and kept it. I couldn't understand a word of her pulse speech, had to read her vitals off a translator screen the whole time. She still held still for me longer than half the human patients I trained on back home, and I kept thinking about your yard the entire time, how much of what you taught me wasn't really about being fearless. It was about learning to be useful to something you don't understand yet without needing to understand it first. That's most of what this whole rotation turned out to be if you want the honest version. Dessau watched the girl for a moment, the exhaustion, the quiet pride underneath it, the complete absence of the fear that had colored her voice on the first night in that cramped common room. You're going to be good at this, not because you're fearless, because you already know the difference between holding still out of terror and holding still on purpose. I learned that from someone, Naomi said, and did not need to say who. And Elias Ford, standing at the front of the human line with his arm fully healed and a steadiness in his shoulders that had not been there on the morning Dessau first found him pinned to a support strut, was named, by unanimous vote of the Academy's Joint Disciplinary Council, Vray's recommendation, seconded, to Dessau's private and considerable satisfaction, by Korvath himself, as the first human cadet ever appointed to serve on that council's standing membership, with a formal mandate to review any future proving custom before it was applied to any species new to the program. You built that, Reyes told her quietly, standing beside her at the edge of the formation while the ceremony continued, watching Elias take his place on the dais among instructors twice and 3 times his age. All of it. I want you to hear me say it plainly, because I don't think I said much of anything plainly to you when you first walked into my office. They built it, sir. I just made sure the ground under them could hold the weight. That's not nothing, Sergeant. That's most of what leadership actually is. He was quiet a moment, watching the ceremony. Fleet's already asking whether you'd extend your posting. I imagine you've heard. She had. The message had come through 2 days earlier, phrased with the particular careful neutrality Fleet used when it wanted an answer without appearing to pressure one. A note that MilitarySciFi's program had shown measurable, unprecedented improvement under her liaison command, that the ratified treaty amendments implementation across other stations would benefit from her continued presence to advise the process, that her posting could be extended indefinitely at her own discretion. I've thought about it, she told Reyes. And there's a Kyrnthai cohort 3 systems out that just enrolled under a rule I helped fix sight unseen. There's probably a dozen more academies across this Concord with holes nobody's found yet, because nobody's needed to find them until the wrong cadet walked in wrong built for whatever custom was waiting. She watched Elias take the oath of council membership, voice steady, unhurried, nothing left in him of the boy who'd nearly apologized for someone else's hands on his throat 11 weeks earlier. These 5 don't need me standing over them anymore, sir. They need the room to prove that. I think the kindest thing I can do for what we built here is trust it to hold without me watching it every morning. Reyes didn't argue. She hadn't expected him to. 4 years of careful diplomacy had at least taught him to recognize a decision that wasn't asking for a second opinion. Elia's first case on the Joint Disciplinary Council came 8 days after the ceremony, and Dessau heard about it only after it had already been resolved, which she counted, privately, as the clearest proof yet that the thing she'd built no longer needed her standing behind it. A newly arrived Vashti cadet diplomatic track, barely 3 weeks into her first rotation, built along thin, reed-like lines even by her own species standards, had been assigned to a joint survival evaluation under a Threndy instructor whose idea of testing resolve leaned, Dessau gathered second-hand, uncomfortably close to the pattern she recognized from her very first weeks at MilitarySciFi. A punishing pace justified as tradition, a quiet refusal to adjust it when the cadet's physiology plainly could not sustain it, an instructor's arms-folded patience, while a young cadet struggled toward a breaking point nobody in authority seemed inclined to prevent. The Vashti cadet's roommate, unsure who else to bring it to, had gone to Elias directly, because word had moved through the incoming rotation, the way word moved through any institution once a story mattered enough, that the human council member was the one who actually listened. Elias had not needed Dessau to tell him what to do with it. He had pulled the Threndy instructor's training pace logs, cross-referenced them against the Vashti physiological baseline in the Academy's own medical archive. A step, she learned later, that Naomi had walked him through in an hour at the common room table, and brought the discrepancy to the full council within 2 days, calm, exact, entirely without the theater a lesser advocate might have reached for. The council had adjusted the evaluation standard for Vashti cadets within the week, quietly, procedurally, with no arena required and no delegation watching, because the fix, this time, hadn't needed a spectacle to land. It had only needed someone in the room willing to look at the actual numbers instead of the comfortable assumption underneath them. "You didn't even mention it to me," Dessa said, when she finally heard the story from Nell rather than from Elias himself. "Didn't think I needed to," Elias said, when she raised it with him directly, and there was no false modesty in it, only the plain confidence of a young man who had, somewhere across the rotation, stopped needing anyone's permission to do the thing he already knew was right. "You spent 11 weeks teaching me. The numbers mattered more than anyone's comfort with the tradition. Seemed like a strange time to start asking whether you approved before I used it." "I don't approve," she told him, and let the smallest real smile she'd allowed herself in weeks show through. "I'm just satisfied. There's a difference and you've earned knowing it." It was a small case. No delegation watched it, no bulletin carried it past the Academy's own internal record, and the Vashti cadet whose evaluation standard changed, because of it would likely never know Dessa Akafer's name at all. That, she thought, turning it over that evening at the yard's edge, watching Elias run a warm-up set with the same patient economy he'd learned from her, and had already begun teaching forward, was precisely the proof she'd been waiting 11 weeks to see. Not another arena, not another reckoning loud enough to reach a Concord assembly, but the quiet, unglamorous, entirely unphotographed work of a rule getting fixed before anyone ever needed to stand in the gap it used to leave open. She gave herself 2 more weeks before she requested the transfer, long enough to see the incoming rotation settle, long enough to watch the 5 of them run an 0500 session without her standing at the head of the line for the first time since the morning she'd claimed that yard as her own. She stood at the edge instead, arms loose, watching, and understood within the first 10 minutes that the drills had not softened in her absence. If anything, Priya ran the pace harder than Dessa herself might have, and Elias corrected Devon's footwork with the exact patient economy Dessa had spent 11 weeks teaching him, and Naomi held a stillness exercise at the Mats Center for the full 20 minutes without so much as a Dren cadet's approving click to notice. Because she had stopped needing the click to know the discipline was hers now, and not a performance for anyone watching. Corvath found her there, at the yard's edge, on what both of them understood without saying aloud was likely to be one of her last mornings on station. "You are leaving," he said, "not a question. There's a Kyrnthai cohort out past the rim that never had anyone stand where I stood on my first morning here. Seemed like a poor use of whatever I learned at Meridian Spire, letting it sit still in one place once the ground here could hold its own weight." He was quiet a while, watching the drills, and when he spoke again his trade tongue had lost the last of the wary formality it had carried across the whole rotation, replaced by something closer to the way he spoke now to the cadets he'd once hunted for sport. "I have been trying to decide since the arena what I owe you for what I allowed to happen before you arrived. I do not think there is an answer large enough. I have settled instead on a smaller one." He turned to face her fully. "I have petitioned Vray to sponsor my transfer to the Joint Disciplinary Council's advisory seat, alongside Cadet Ford. I intend to spend the remainder of my academy career making certain no cadet at Meridian Spire is ever again handed a custom with a hole cut exactly the width of their throat, whatever species walks through that gate next." "That's a good use of what you learned too. I imagine it hasn't been free." Corvath's throat sac clicked once low, and for the first time since she'd known him she heard something in it that sounded almost like rueful humor. "My clan has not disowned me, if that is what you are asking. It is smaller than that, and larger. 2 families who once courted an alliance with mine through my eventual rank have quietly withdrawn their interest." My own sire's letters have grown shorter and colder and increasingly concerned with reminding me what a Dren cadet of my bloodline is meant to become. He held her gaze without flinching from it. I find, to my own surprise, that I do not much care. I spent 19 years believing my worth was measured by how thoroughly I could make something smaller than myself yield. I have spent one rotation learning it is measured instead by whether I can look at what I have done and choose, honestly, to do differently. The second measurement costs more allies. I have decided it is the only one worth keeping. That's not a small thing to say out loud on a station where your own delegation is still listening. No, it is not. He inclined his skull, unhurried, the ritual weight of it settling over the two of them in the quiet yard. I did not say it to you for comfort, Sergeant. I said it because I wanted one honest witness to hear me choose it plainly, before I have to choose it again in smaller rooms for the rest of my career without anyone watching at all. I learned it from watching you decide not to hate me, Sergeant, when I gave you every reason to. His crest, she had learned to read that gesture, finally, somewhere in the last month, the same small lift Overseer Corrins had carried in the chamber corridor, settled, slow, deliberate. I do not think I will ever fully understand your species. I have decided I no longer need to know that I was wrong about what smallness meant, and that the wrongness was mine to correct rather than yours to forgive. She left him at the yard, still watching the 5 cadets run their sets without her, and found the others waiting in the cramped common room that had, across a rotation, stopped being cramped and started simply being theirs. 5 bunks, 5 lockers, 1 window on the slow turn of stars. A space that had held more honest conversation in 11 weeks than most rooms held in a lifetime. Fleet's cutting my transfer orders tomorrow, she told them, no preamble, because she had promised them plain speech on the first night and saw no reason to soften it on the last. I wanted you to hear it from me before the manifest did. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Devon, 17, going on considerably older than his file had once suggested, said what she suspected all 5 of them had been quietly working up the nerve to say for weeks. You could stay. Fleet offered it. Rays told us. I could. She sat finally in the one chair, the way she had on her very first night in this room, though the room around her, and the 5 people in it, bore almost no resemblance to what she'd walked into 11 weeks ago. I've thought hard about it, and I want you to hear the actual reason I'm not going to, because it isn't that I don't want to watch what you 5 do next. It's that I already know what you're going to do next, and watching it happen without me isn't a loss. It's the whole point of the job. What is the point of the job? Ito asked, quiet. To make yourself unnecessary. Slowly, on purpose, one honest lesson at a time, until the people you train don't need you standing behind them to hold the line you taught them to hold. She looked around the small room, at 5 faces that had absorbed in a single rotation more than most cadets absorbed in a full career. Priya's careful engineer's patience, Elia's earned steadiness, Naomi's trained stillness, Devon's fluent curiosity, Ito's rebuilt endurance. I've spent 30 years learning that the officers worth remembering aren't the ones who stay forever. They're the ones who leave, and the thing they built keeps holding anyway. Naomi was the one who finally broke the quiet that followed, and when she spoke her voice carried none of the fear it had carried the first night Dissa met her, asking whether one more adult was going to tell her to hold on. You said, that first night, you'd let us know if you ever meant to lose. I don't think you ever have. No, Dissa agreed. I haven't. Her transfer orders came through the following morning, and with them a specific assignment she had not fully expected, not simply an advisory role at some distant academy, but the same liaison command, replicated, at the Kyrnthai cohort station 3 systems out. The very cadets whose enrollment bulletin had crossed her desk weeks earlier under the 5 bloodless words, "No incident to report." Fleet, it seemed, had read the same reports Rays had filed, and had decided that whatever she'd built at Meridian Spire was not a fluke to be studied from a distance, but a method worth deploying again, deliberately, wherever the next gap in the Concord's 40-year-old assumptions was likely to surface first. She packed light, the way she always had, because 30 years of postings had taught her that a soldier who needed more than a single duffel to leave a place had probably stayed somewhere too long. What she carried out with her that she had not carried in was smaller than a duffel and heavier than anything else she owned. Vray's carved marker, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her kit. A data slate loaded with 11 weeks of training logs she intended to hand-deliver to whatever officer fleet assigned to relieve her, so the next liaison would not have to rebuild from nothing the way she had. And a single folded page, handed to her the night before by Elias on behalf of all 5, that she did not open until she was already aboard the shuttle, strapped in, the ring falling away below the viewport in the same slow blue morning light that had greeted her arrival. It was not long. It was, in its way, exactly the kind of plain, unembellished statement she'd have written herself, if the situation had ever asked it of her rather than the reverse, 5 names, signed beneath a single line. We held. Because you told us the truth about how long it would take, and then you stayed exactly as long as you said you would, and not 1 day less. She read it twice, and then folded it back into its careful square, and looked out at the turning wheel of Meridian Spire receding behind the shuttle's wake. 5 human cadets somewhere on that ring who no longer needed her standing at the yard's edge at 0500 to know precisely what they were capable of holding. The receiving yard at the Cairnthai station was nothing like the one she'd left. It sat beneath a translucent dome flooded not with the pale blue daylight of Meridian Spire's outer ring, but with the deep green-gold light of a world with 2 suns, filtered through kilometers of station glass built to Cairnthai comfort rather than human, and the air carried a faint mineral tang from the pressurized wetlands 3 decks below that no amount of station filtration ever fully scrubbed away. She stood at the base of the shuttle ramp for a long moment before it finished lowering, listening to a soundscape she did not yet have the vocabulary to parse, low resonant pressure pulses instead of speech, the wet slap of something large and graceful moving through a corridor built half of water, and felt, for the first time in 11 weeks, the particular calm of a soldier standing on unfamiliar ground with a plan already built and a purpose already clear. The ramp finished lowering. Somewhere across the yard, she heard it before she saw it, the specific, unmistakable sound of something larger than a body hitting something that was not built to absorb the impact. HFY did not run. She had learned a long time ago what running told a room about how afraid you were of what was happening in it, and she had not been afraid of that particular sound in longer than she could remember. She settled her duffel on her shoulder, and she walked, unhurried, toward whatever was waiting for her on the other side of the yard, because somewhere in that crowd of strangers there was almost certainly a cadet who could not yet imagine that the worst morning of their rotation was also, without their knowing it yet, about to become the first morning of the last one. She had done this before. She would, she suspected, do it again on some other station, for some other species, for as long as the Concord kept finding new places where an old rules blind spot met a young body that had never been given a way to ask for it to stop. That was, she had come to understand across one long rotation at Meridian Spire, the actual shape of the work, not a single dramatic morning in a crowded arena, not one perfect, unforgettable look that froze a room and ended a threat everyone else had learned to tolerate, though there would probably be another morning like that one before this posting was finished, because there always was, somewhere, once you started looking for the doors people had quietly decided not to open. The work was smaller than that and larger. It was showing up before dawn, for as many mornings as it took, and teaching a frightened body that it could hold longer than anyone watching believed it could. And then, when holding was no longer enough, walking the rest of the way across whatever yard needed crossing, unhurried, entirely without doubt, until the only sound left in the whole wide room was the sound of someone finally, quietly, letting go.